About 20 years ago, I was in Big Bend National Park, preparing for a backpacking series presentation for REI. I wanted to get some photos that would capture the essence of the park, especially near Santa Elena Canyon. I arrived in the afternoon, hiking along a trail that led down toward the broad river basin that opens at the mouth of the canyon. The basin itself was a contrast to the steep canyon walls, a flat, expansive area where the Rio Grande spread out and wildlife seemed more concentrated. The light was beginning to soften, a couple of hours from sunset, casting long shadows across the desert and low hills, making the scene almost hypnotically beautiful. I had parked my van several hundred meters back at what passed for a trailhead at the time. It was quiet, mostly the occasional rustle of dry brush in the wind, birds calling from distant mesquite trees, and the faint sound of water running in the river. I was moving slowly, trying to frame shots, thinking about how they would appear in the presentation. The desert has a way of lulling you into a meditative rhythm. You move along a trail, listen to the brush crackle under your feet, and feel like you're in complete control, but there's always the undercurrent that you aren't. As I approached the river basin, I noticed something unusual on the far side of the river. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it in familiar terms. It looked like a medium-sized deer lying on its side, sliding along the ground in a way that no deer should move. But it was too large, too deliberate. My brain hesitated, refusing to process the movement fully until I adjusted my angle, squinting into the shadows. It took a few heartbeats before I realized what I was seeing. It was a mountain lion, a big cat, low to the ground, creeping along with the unmistakable grace and menace of a predator on the hunt. Its body was taut and fluid, every muscle coordinated, eyes fixed on something invisible to me, probably just beyond a stone's throw from where I was standing. I froze. Even the wind seemed to pause in that instant, the desert holding its breath. Then it looked up. Its eyes found me. I'll never forget that moment. There was intelligence in that gaze, a silent calculation running behind the predatory instinct. It was sizing me up, weighing me as a possible threat, or perhaps, in its own cold calculus, as a meal. My chest tightened, and my hands went clammy. My first thought was gratitude for the river between us. Even in a low-water year, the Rio Grande looked like a wall of liquid that demanded respect. My mind raced through what I knew about the species, instinctively recalling everything about mountain lions. They are ambush predators, powerful, and capable of short bursts of incredible speed. Death Kitty, as I started silently calling it in my head, shifted its gaze repeatedly between me and whatever it was hunting on my side of the river. Its head moved back and forth, a precise, careful calculation of risk versus reward. I began to move slowly backward, keeping my eyes on it, every step deliberate. I tried not to make any sudden movements, not to give it any reason to test its curiosity or hunger. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I focused on the rhythm of my breathing, the slow movement of my feet, the shifting light across the river. I wasn't sure if it was the river acting as a barrier, if I was simply not worth the effort, or if the mountain lion just wasn't hungry for a human that evening. Whatever the reason, after a few tense minutes that felt like hours, it stopped, crouched low, and disappeared back into the shadows of the far bank. I exhaled slowly, almost collapsing inward with relief, and continued my cautious retreat. Every step toward the van felt disproportionately long, the walk stretching into eternity as I tried not to stumble, not to make noise, not to look back. When I finally reached the van, I sank into the driver's seat, hands still shaking, trying to slow my racing heart. That night, I stayed parked off the main park road in a quiet area known for big cat activity. I ate stale Oreos, drank warm water from a bottle, and listened. From the darkness came low growls, screams, and the occasional pounce of some unseen creature. The sounds echoed across the desert hills and through the basin, a reminder that I was very much a guest in someone else's territory. I felt simultaneously terrified and grateful. The silence of the canyon walls, the whispering of the brush, the reflective surface of the river, all reminded me that I had survived an encounter most people only read about in books. Later, I took precautions, keeping the van close and my lights on, carefully choosing where I hiked. The hallucination on NyQuil after a respiratory illness that night was another layer of terror, waking up screaming in the middle of the pitch-dark desert, only to realize the only real danger was the pounding in my own chest. I reminded myself that Big Bend is unforgiving but not malevolent. Survival there is about respect, awareness, and humility. By sunrise, the park was calm again. The Rio Grande reflected soft pinks and golds. Deer grazed quietly at the edge of the basin, and the air smelled like earth and early morning sun. I packed up my gear, drove out along the dusty roads, and felt the weight of the night's encounter slowly lift. I had photos for the presentation, yes, but more importantly, I carried a visceral lesson about nature's precision and power. It wasn't a tale of ghosts or legends. It was real life, real danger, and a clear reminder that I had been lucky to return unscathed. Every time I remember that day, I feel the tension, the adrenaline, and the profound respect for a wild predator that is both beautiful and deadly, living just beyond the edge of human control. I was out in the fields early that morning, cutting the drainage ditches with the tractor, watching the sunlight spread over the farm. The air had that fresh, clean smell you only get after a late winter thaw, with a hint of salt coming from the sound. My grandbaby, Ellie, and her babysitter, Marcy, were always looking for ways to spend time outside, and today they decided to make the long hike across our farm lots down to the beach. Ellie was 5, full of energy and curiosity, and Marcy, who was 13, always seemed to have a plan. She had packed a backpack with sandwiches, drinks, and a couple of little snacks, got them both in their bathing suits, added their pants, and those big sun hats my wife insisted they wear, and they were ready to go. I saw them leave, with our 2 big mastiffs bounding alongside, tails wagging like banners in the wind. Our old duck, Gus, waddled out behind them. He was a funny little thing, hatched with a defective wing, and my wife had kept him around as a pet. He wasn't shy, especially if there was food involved. Ellie immediately scooped him up, laughing, holding him like he was part of their expedition. I saw her lift him up toward Marcy's backpack, probably thinking about Nutella on toast. Then they were off, the 2 girls, 2 dogs, and a little duck disappearing across the grassy lots, the sun hats bobbing as they walked. The hike was long, even across fields that we didn't plant yet. I kept an eye on them while running the tractor, mowing the edges and cleaning out the ditches. I could see the girls settling down for lunch when I glanced up. They had spread a small blanket near a clump of low shrubs, sandwiches laid out, and they were laughing, watching the dogs circle around the duck. It was strange, the way our mastiffs positioned themselves whenever Gus waddled toward a different direction, almost like they were guarding him. Gus would quack sharply, and the dogs would immediately shift positions, walling off, ears alert, bodies tense but controlled. I've seen them do this before, but there was something about today that made them extra cautious, as if they were sensing something in the fields I couldn't see. Later, 2 more dogs from our home, younger and a little wild, came bounding down the hill, barking and chasing one another. Marcy got frustrated. She had made the trek with a careful plan, and these dogs were being disruptive. She decided Gus needed to head home before the chaos got worse. She stripped off the wet bathing suits, put on a t-shirt and sweats to walk back dry, and got the girls, the duck, and the 2 mastiffs moving again toward the house. I continued working on the drainage ditches, running the tractor slowly, but still keeping an eye on them. The lot is big, but I could see Ellie and Marcy walking along the edge of the non-planted area with the animals in tow. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach twist. A full-size person was moving quickly across the open field behind them, not walking casually, running, almost sprinting. My heart jumped. I knew it wasn't anyone from our farm. The area is remote, and the only people who usually come through are fishermen on the Sound or neighbors cutting across for shortcuts, but no one would be running like that, not toward 2 kids and dogs. I killed the tractor's engine, dropping down and running toward the girls while pulling my phone from my pocket. I waved them over, and as I got closer, they turned toward me. Marcy's eyes were wide, holding Gus close, the mastiffs flanking them, watching that spot in the distance like they were ready to protect. I jumped on the tractor and drove the last stretch to meet them. We got back to the house, safe, but the image of that runner stayed with me. I called my field hands immediately. Together, we returned to the spot near the Sound's beach access where I had seen the person. The fields were empty now, and the tide's light breeze carried only the smell of wet grass and salt. We started walking carefully, scanning the tall grasses and low shrubs. Footprints, small, fast ones, leading through the non-planted lot toward a thicket that ran along the edge of the property. Whoever was been hiding, watching, waiting. The realization hit me hard. The duck and the dogs had been the only reason Marcy and Ellie weren't spotted sooner. Gus had quacked, and the mastiffs had instantly positioned themselves between the duck and the intruder. Their instincts, their loyalty, had kept my grandbaby and her babysitter safe. We followed the tracks to a small depression behind a row of bushes. There were signs someone had tried to stay hidden. A small, flattened spot where it looked like they'd crouched, some discarded trash, a makeshift camp. Whoever it was had left quickly when the girls started moving again with Gus and the dogs. I could see now how close it had been. My heart was still pounding, but there was relief too. No one had approached them, no one had touched them, and they were safe because of the girls' awareness and the animals' instincts. After that, I made sure the girls stayed closer to the house for a while, and the mastiffs were never off leash when they went outside again. Gus, waddling beside them, became their little hero. Marcy laughed at first, brushing it off, but I know she felt the weight of it too. I stayed out in the field a long time that evening, walking the paths they had taken, checking the lines of sight, memorizing every bush and dip. I wanted to make sure nothing like that ever happened again. By the end of the day, I was exhausted but relieved. The sun had set, painting the fields and the Sound in a golden glow. Ellie was tired, lying in the grass with Gus nestled beside her. Marcy sprawled out on the blanket. The dogs flopped down, content and tired from their day of duty. I looked at them and felt a deep sense of gratitude. Nothing supernatural, no fairy tale endings, just instincts, quick thinking, and luck. They were safe, and the threat had vanished. The farm was quiet again. The only sound the distant lapping of waves and the soft quacks of a very brave little duck. Everything was clear now. The girls had learned, the dogs had protected, and the farm remained their safe world. I decided to get out of the house that day because I couldn't stand being around my own thoughts, let alone anyone else's. I was feeling drained and hollow, carrying the weight of an awful breakup that had left me questioning myself in every way. The Rockies seemed like the only place that could quiet my mind, at least for a little while. I didn't plan much. I didn't care much. I just wanted to be somewhere where I could disappear into the vastness and feel smaller than my problems. I started out early, parking at a trailhead I knew, but immediately veering off the marked path. I told myself I wanted to explore, wanted something raw and untouched. The snow was still thick in patches, and ice covered most of the smaller streams that cut through the slopes. The air was sharp and clean, stinging my lungs in a way that somehow felt purifying. I was moving without real direction, slipping occasionally on hidden ice, catching myself on shrubs and rocks, laughing quietly at my own clumsiness. At one point, I tried to cross a shallow stream. I misjudged the slick ice beneath the water and went down hard, my ass plunging through the ice into the freezing water. Cold seeped through my clothes instantly, shocking every nerve. For a moment, I just lay there, feeling the water soak through, and I didn't even care. I thought about turning back, heading to my car, giving up on the whole off-trail idea, but some stubborn part of me said, fuck it. I pulled myself up, dripping, shivering, and continued uphill. I wasn't entirely sure why I kept going, but there was some strange need in me to push forward, even if it didn't make sense. The climb became steeper, more challenging. Snow gave way to exposed rocks and patches of ice, making every step deliberate. My legs burned, my boots crunched against frozen soil, and the wind tugged at my jacket and hat. It felt like the mountain was alive in its own quiet way, Indifferent, but somehow monumental. I was halfway up one particularly steep incline when my foot hit something hard. I froze and looked down, expecting a rock, but instead, I saw a leg bone poking through the snow and dirt. I knelt down, brushing off the snow, and realized it was an actual animal bone, bleached and weathered. I thought, almost in disbelief, well, that's cool, because I've always been a little fascinated by nature's way of reclaiming itself. But then I noticed more bones just a few feet away, scattered and partially buried. There were limbs, parts of a spine, and the shapes of other fragments I couldn't immediately identify. No blood, no gore, just bones arranged in a pattern that suggested some predator had been at work. My stomach dropped. This wasn't fresh, wasn't recent, but it was enough to tell me that this patch of the Rockies had a history, one that involved something dangerous. I stood there, trying to process it, listening intently. The wind was constant, the only sound other than the occasional creak of ice and rustle of branches. I didn't hear any birds, any movement, just the quiet, bone-deep silence. My initial fascination wavered into a sharp edge of caution. I took a few photos from a safe distance, tried to capture the surreal mix of beauty and decay. Each shot made my heart beat faster, adrenaline sneaking in like a cold wind. I decided to head down, thinking the safest thing was to get back toward my car before anything else happened. The descent was slower. Ice patches demanded careful steps, and every slip reminded me of my earlier fall. My mind replayed the image of those bones, wondering what creature had left them and what might still be nearby. Curiosity gnawed at me, though, and against my better judgment, I turned back halfway down the hill, telling myself I was overthinking. I didn't want my day to end so quickly, didn't want to let fear take over entirely. I had taken only a few steps uphill when I heard it, a low, deliberate sound at the top of the slope. It wasn't wind. It wasn't snow cracking under its own weight. It was something heavier, pacing, moving with intent. I froze instantly, the hairs on my neck rising, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't stick around to see it. Every instinct screamed to retreat, so I turned and scrambled down, boots sliding, hands gripping rocks and frozen dirt, nearly plunging into that same shallow stream again. When I finally made it back to firmer ground and to my car, I collapsed against it, dripping wet, shaking and exhausted. My clothes were soaked through, my body numb from cold and adrenaline. I sat there for a long time, catching my breath, watching the wind sweep through the trees, realizing that I had been lucky. That hill, that area of bones, whatever creature had made it its home, it wasn't something I wanted to encounter up close. I packed up slowly, drying off as best as I could with what little I had, and drove down the winding roads, feeling a mix of relief and awe. The mountains had reminded me of my own smallness, my fragility, and the raw unpredictability of nature. It wasn't terrifying in a fantastical way, but in a stark, real sense. Something real and wild had existed there long before me, and would long outlast me. I kept thinking about those bones, about the silence, about the weight of being watched without ever seeing what was watching. By the time I got home, I felt oddly lighter. The hike hadn't cured my depression, hadn't erased the pain, but it had reminded me that the world was larger than my misery, that life went on in ways both beautiful and brutal, indifferent to my problems. I washed my clothes, warmed up, and made myself a simple meal, sitting quietly in my own space, letting the memory of that mountain slope sink in. I couldn't stop thinking about the sheer unpredictability of being out there alone, but I also felt an odd pride in having gone through it and come back. The experience stayed with me, a reminder that the world is full of raw, real moments that are frightening, humbling, and strangely clarifying all at once. I never thought a simple weekday hike could turn into something that stayed with me for weeks, the kind of experience that makes your skin crawl every time you think about it. My husband and I decided to go to a state park on the East Coast, a place we had visited several times before. It was midweek, so the trails were almost empty, just the way we liked it. Our dog was with us, a large, sturdy retriever who loved long walks through the forest. The morning had been bright and calm. Birds chirped lazily in the treetops, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush reminded us that we were sharing the woods with other creatures, but nothing alarming. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth, and the sun filtered through the canopy in golden streams. We had packed a small lunch and water, planning for a 3-hour loop trail we knew well, a trail that wound along ridges, through shallow valleys, and around a small creek. At first, the hike was exactly what we expected. The dog ran ahead of us in bursts of energy, sniffing at trees, chasing the occasional squirrel, then returning to our side. My husband and I walked side by side, enjoying the quiet, the isolation, and the freedom from cell phones, work, and the constant pull of the outside world. It was almost meditative, and for a long while, the only sounds were our own footsteps on the soft dirt trail, the occasional bark of our dog, and the natural noises of the forest. Then, just as we reached a slight clearing on a ridge, I noticed something. It started subtly, a faint sound that didn't belong in the natural rhythm of the woods. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the branches, a trick of my own ears. But then it grew clearer. It was chanting, very low at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I paused and looked at my husband, unsure if I was imagining it. He nodded, signaling that he heard it too, but he put a finger to his lips, urging silence. Our dog's ears went rigid, and I could see the muscles along his back tighten, his fur standing up as he froze, alert and wary. That made my stomach knot with unease. As we continued forward cautiously, the chanting became unmistakable. It wasn't faint anymore. It was rich, resonant, and clear, like a group of monks in a cathedral somewhere far away, yet right next to us. The sound seemed to hover above the trail, surrounding us, yet without a visible source. The rhythm of it was hypnotic, deep, and melodic, like something from a Gregorian chant. I felt a strange tension building in my chest. Every instinct told me to turn back, to leave, but curiosity and disbelief kept my feet moving forward. I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe some kids were hiding somewhere with a speaker, playing a recording as a prank. That seemed plausible, though I couldn't imagine why anyone would go to such lengths in the middle of a workday on a nearly empty trail. Yet, I held on to that thought like a lifeline, trying to calm my nerves. My husband didn't speak, just moved carefully ahead, our dog pacing silently between us, alert and tense. 4 or 5 minutes, we walked through that eerie, invisible choir. The chant was perfectly clear, words that were foreign, yet strangely solemn. It filled the space of the woods around us, bouncing off trees, blending with the natural sounds in a way that made it feel almost sacred. The hairs on my arms stood up, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. My rational mind kept trying to convince me it was nothing more than technology and teenage mischief, but it felt impossible. No phones, no speakers, no other people. Just us, the dog, and the chanting that had no visible source. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting stopped. No fade, no echo, no gradual disappearance, just silence. It was almost shocking how quickly the forest returned to its natural state. Birds chirped again, the wind whispered through the trees, and our footsteps sounded loud and intrusive in the emptiness. My hands shook slightly as I grabbed my water bottle, trying to feel normal. My husband gave me a small, tight nod, and without speaking, we continued back the 3 miles to the parking area. The rest of the hike was quiet. Neither of us spoke more than a few words, and the dog seemed tense but relieved, finally relaxing slightly when we reached the more familiar parts of the trail. By the time we reached the car, the normal sounds of the parking area, cars, distant voices, and the general bustle, felt almost jarring after the intense quiet and the inexplicable chant. My husband and I packed up slowly, each lost in thought, replaying the sound in our minds, trying to find a rational explanation. At the end of the day, I convinced myself that it must have been some strange trick of sound, an acoustic anomaly caused by the shape of the valley, perhaps the wind carrying the sound of an actual recording from far away. Maybe some researchers or performers had been testing audio equipment in the forest, or some construction or maintenance crews had an unusual speaker system nearby. Nothing about it made sense, yet I felt a quiet relief in settling on some explanation, no matter how unlikely. Even now, weeks later, I can close my eyes and hear the resonance of the chanting, impossibly clear, impossibly close. It didn't have a source I could identify. I didn't see anyone, didn't encounter anything tangible, and nothing in the woods appeared disturbed or out of place. But it left a mark on me, a reminder that the world can hold experiences that are entirely real and terrifying, even when there is nothing to point to. It wasn't a ghost, it wasn't supernatural, it was just sound, but it felt impossibly alive, impossibly intentional, and impossibly out of place in a quiet, empty forest on a weekday hike. And the fact that it happened in broad daylight, with no one else around, made it even more unsettling. It was a strange, unexplained moment that didn't harm anyone, but it changed the way I listen when I walk in the woods. The forest feels less empty now, as if it could be holding on to sounds and secrets I cannot understand. I worked in a rainforest in Southeast Asia many years ago during a research project on nocturnal insects. Part of our work involved trapping moths at night. It was not a glamorous job, but it was necessary for collecting data. The way it worked was simple in theory, but lonely in practice. You set up a large white sheet in a small clearing and placed a lamp in front of it. The lamp was powered by a small generator, and the sheet acted like a canvas, drawing in every moth within a mile or more. Periodically, I would go out and check what had been attracted. The process was repetitive but strangely mesmerizing. Watching the sheet, illuminated in the darkness, and seeing tiny creatures flutter toward the light gave the night a strange rhythm. Frogs would follow the moths, snakes would follow the frogs, and sometimes even larger predators would come curious about the commotion. Being there alone, in the middle of a rainforest, made you hyper-aware of every sound. The isolation was total. Camp was almost a mile away, so for hours you were truly alone except for the wildlife. One night, it was cloudy and humid. The rain earlier in the evening had left the air thick, and the clouds blocked what little moonlight there might have been. It was a quiet shift from 1 in the morning until 3, and for the first hour nothing much happened. Moths drifted lazily toward the sheet, frogs croaked softly, and the occasional cricket chirped somewhere in the dense vegetation. I had long since stopped feeling lonely during these shifts. I had learned to enjoy the sounds of the rainforest and the patterns of movement among insects. Still, every rustle or snap of a twig made me glance up. That kind of awareness was part of the job. The moment you let yourself relax too much, something dangerous could be nearby, whether a snake slithering unseen or a predator moving quietly. Around 2 in the morning, a rustle came from the woods just beyond the light. At first, I thought it was just a small animal, maybe a civet or a monkey moving through the undergrowth. That was normal, but the sound was heavier than anything I was used to, almost deliberate. I could hear branches bending as something approached. My heart rate quickened. I told myself it was probably a wild pig or a large lizard. I knew the chances of tigers showing up were slim, but still, the imagination runs wild in that darkness. I clutched my notebook and flashlight, keeping my eyes on the shadowy forms moving between the trees. The rustling got closer. Every instinct screamed at me to stand perfectly still, to make no sound. I thought about how my colleagues had warned me about the early morning hours, how predators could be more active, and how human noise could attract them. I could feel sweat forming on the back of my neck despite the sticky heat. The sound stopped for a moment, and then there was a brief silence, so heavy it pressed against my ears. My stomach turned over. The silence was worse than the sound because I had no idea what I was facing. Then it moved again, and in a split second, a face appeared out of the darkness. It was wrong in every way, disembodied, sudden, eyes wide, mouth open in a scream that I could not understand. The scream wasn't human, not in a language I recognized. My body reacted before my brain could catch up. I screamed. I think I even jumped back a step. My hand was shaking so badly I could hardly hold my flashlight. For a few terrifying seconds, I stared, frozen, as the face remained for a fraction of a moment. And then it disappeared back into the trees, leaving the night empty again except for the usual chorus of insects. My chest heaved. I was sweating, my muscles tense, my senses stretched to the breaking point. I couldn't tell how long I stood there, gripping my flashlight like a weapon, convinced I had just had a close encounter with something deadly. Then I heard a faint giggle, high-pitched and almost childlike, carried on the humid air. My mind tried to process it, trying to rationalize what I had seen, but it didn't make sense. The face was gone, but that giggle echoed in my ears, sticking with me. I realized my pulse was still racing and my legs felt weak. It took a minute, maybe more, before my rational mind caught up. The strange giggle, the sudden face, the scream, it wasn't a predator or some supernatural thing. Slowly, I recognized the shapes moving in the underbrush. One of the local lumberjacks who helped maintain the trails and occasionally assisted with the research was crouched there, holding a small torch under his face to make it look terrifying. He had waited for the perfect moment, when I was already tense from being alone and surrounded by the rainforest, and jumped into the clearing just to scare me. My relief was immediate and intense, washing over the fear like a cool wave. I could feel my muscles relax, my heartbeat slowly returning to normal. Once I realized it, I couldn't help but laugh at myself, at how utterly I had fallen for a practical joke. The setup had been perfect. The darkness, the sounds, the isolation, all of it combined to make the scare feel real in every way. I stayed at the sheet for the rest of the night, the tension gone, replaced by a mixture of amusement and lingering adrenaline. The moths continued to come to the light, frogs croaked, and snakes slithered silently among the leaves. I watched the forest come alive in the quiet hours, now aware of the humor in what had happened. The scare reminded me how unpredictable the jungle could be, not just because of wildlife, but because of people and their sense of mischief. By the time I packed up the trap and headed back to camp, I was tired but smiling. The incident became a story I would retell countless times, always with the same mixture of dread and laughter. It reminded me that even in the most isolating and potentially dangerous environments, moments of levity could appear, and the rainforest, for all its intensity, had a way of humbling and entertaining you in equal measure. That night, the fear turned into a memory I cherished, a perfect blend of tension, relief, and humor, leaving me with a story I would never forget. I had been hiking parts of the Appalachian Trail for a while by then. Nothing too crazy, just weekend trips and a few longer stretches when I could manage the time. This one hike was in West Virginia, I think about 8 years ago. I was with a group of friends who were all more experienced than I was, but nothing extreme. Just the usual mix of people who liked the outdoors, liked the challenge, but weren't obsessed. We had spread out naturally along the trail, people moving at their own pace. I was in a middle group of 4. One of the group had to stop and pull a tick off, which was a normal enough interruption on the act. The other 2 stayed with them. One of them our unofficial leader, and I decided to push ahead a little and see if I could catch up with the lead pair. The trail in that section was extremely well marked. White blazes every few steps, sometimes carved into trees, sometimes painted on rocks. I had no doubt I could find my way. The air was crisp and damp, typical West Virginia humidity, and the smell of wet leaves and pine sap filled my nose as I walked. The forest was dense in places, thick underbrush pushing against the trail, but clear enough for hiking. Half a mile down the trail, I hit an old logging road, wide and overgrown with grass and weeds creeping up through cracks in the dirt and gravel. I decided to stop and wait for the rest of my group. While I waited, I wandered a little down this side road. It ran perpendicular to the trail and had a low stone wall on one side, moss-covered and weathered, probably decades old. I walked along the wall, looking for anything interesting, bits of old nails or rusted tin, anything that hinted at the past. At first, everything was normal. Birds chirped, leaves rustled gently in the breeze. the sound of the trail and forest around me filling the quiet gaps between the wind and my own footsteps. But then, almost imperceptibly at first, it felt like I had crossed some invisible line. The moment I stepped just a few feet beyond where I had been wandering, the forest went dead silent. Not just quiet, but the kind of silence that presses down on your ears and chest. The birds stopped singing, the wind stopped rustling the leaves, even the occasional drip of water from a leaf ceased. The sound that remained was just the faint crunch of my boots on the overgrown road, and even it seemed muted, like I was underwater. I hesitated, standing still, scanning down the road. I didn't see anything. No movement, no shadows, nothing that could explain this sudden, unnatural silence. Then it hit me, a sensation so immediate and intense that I can still remember it clearly. It was like stepping into the personal space of someone who hated me beyond reason, magnified 100 times. Every hair on my body stood on end. My stomach twisted and my skin crawled. My chest tightened. The feeling wasn't abstract. It was directional, as if it emanated from the road ahead, a heavy, uninvited pressure pressing against me, a silent warning I couldn't ignore. I took a few hesitant steps forward, almost testing the line I had crossed, and the sensation only intensified. It was unwelcome in a way I've never experienced before and hope never to experience again. I couldn't bring myself to look away from the road, didn't want to risk turning my back on whatever it was I felt. It wasn't fear in the normal sense. There were no animals, no threats I could see, but an undeniable instinct that I did not belong there. Something in me knew instantly that if I stayed, something could go very wrong. I started to step backward slowly, my eyes fixed straight down the overgrown path, taking careful, deliberate steps while trying not to blink, not to break the connection to the boundary I had crossed. My mind raced with possibilities. I tried to reason it out. Maybe I had stumbled into a bare trail or some hidden den. Maybe there were unstable old structures. Maybe it was just the isolation messing with me. Rationally, I knew none of those explanations fit the exact sensation of being actively, violently unwelcome, but my body didn't care about rationality. It felt like the invisible wall I had crossed extended for a few feet beyond where I had been walking. When my boots hit a patch where the road's overgrowth met the old trail's edge, the pressure suddenly lifted. Birds sang again, leaves rustled in the wind. Even the subtle hum of insects returned. The forest sounded normal again, as if it had never shut down. My breathing, which I hadn't realized had gotten shallow and rapid, steadied. I stayed where I was, eyes glued to the road ahead, waiting for my body to stop trembling. I didn't turn around immediately. I stayed facing the road, trying to convince myself that I hadn't imagined it, that the sensation was real but completely gone. After a few minutes, the sound of voices approached, and my group caught up. My leader called out, asking if I'd seen anything interesting down the road. I smiled, shook my head, and suggested we keep moving. We left the logging road behind and got back on a main trail. The rest of the hike went as planned. We passed old creek beds, climbed rocky outcrops, and crossed fallen logs, and I kept replaying the feeling I had experienced. I couldn't explain it logically, but it was real enough to stay with me. By the time we reached the next campsite, I felt normal again, but I never forgot that stretch of the trail, that invisible line, and the way the world could feel completely ordinary one moment, and then suddenly entirely alien the next. It was a visceral reminder that nature, even in familiar surroundings, can still surprise you with something utterly beyond explanation. From then on, whenever I hike alone or explore off-trail, I respect boundaries I don't understand and never take familiar routes for granted. That day left me more cautious, more attentive, and strangely grateful for the ordinary, predictable rhythm of the woods. I had been on my fair share of hikes, but some of the moments that stuck with me were scary in different ways, each unique in its own unsettling fashion. One of the first times I really felt it was on the Tongariro circuit in New Zealand. I had been hiking between two huts, exhausted toward the end of the day. The trail was along a ridge, the terrain mostly barren, with jagged volcanic rock and tufts of grass breaking the monotony. I was tired, slower than I wanted to be, though I had plenty of water, food, and warm clothes. I was safe, but my body was yelling at me to rest. There were no other people around. The Tongariro crossing was crowded with tourists, but this circuit, a less traveled loop, left me completely alone. The trail markers stretched ahead of me in what seemed like an endless line. The ridge rolled on with no significant changes, and I started to feel a strange unease, the kind that creeps in when the landscape doesn't change and the silence is absolute. I caught myself wondering if I had somehow died and been dropped in purgatory without realizing it. The wind picked up, sharp and cold, carrying dust and tiny rocks, and I wrapped my jacket tighter around me. The silence pressed on my ears, punctuated only by the crunch of my boots on the coarse trail. My mind refused to relax, and each step felt heavier than the last. The ridge seemed eternal, and I questioned whether my sense of time was accurate. Every flag I passed looked the same, and I felt a creeping sense of isolation that gnawed at the edges of my composure. Eventually, I reached the next hut. Its warmth and the faint smell of wood smoke reassured me. I collapsed inside, exhausted but grateful. I had walked through a landscape that was magnificent, yes, but also deeply unnerving in its emptiness. Another moment came in southern British Columbia. We had hiked up to a lookout, a fairly easy trail, and were making our way back down when I noticed fresh cougar dung in a spot we had passed just 15 to 20 minutes earlier. We were all healthy adults, no children or pets, but the realization that a predator was likely nearby sharpened every sense. Our eyes scanned the surrounding trees, every snapping twig making our hearts jump. The forest around us was dense, with patches of sunlight piercing the canopy, and the smell of damp earth hung in the air. The knowledge that a cougar could be observing us without our noticing was chilling. We walked faster, staying alert, making deliberate, noisy movements. Each step down the mountain felt tense, every shadow potentially hiding the predator. The danger was invisible, immediate, and real, unlike the abstract fears I sometimes entertained on empty ridges. We eventually reached the safety of the lower trail, but the memory of that dung and the knowledge of what could have been remained vivid. In the Glass House Mountains, another layer of fear emerged. My friend and I, two women hiking together, reached the summit and encountered a man who struck up a conversation. Initially harmless, his comments soon became suggestive and unsettling. My friend sensed the danger immediately, and I reacted instinctively, telling him to leave us alone. He attempted to follow us down the trail, prompting a tense encounter with another hiker who intervened. We continued quickly, hearts pounding, but the unease didn't end. That night, while sitting by our tent, we heard a man asking our neighboring campers if they had seen two women. The sound made our skin crawl, but we stayed hidden and unnoticed. The next day, we spoke with other hikers who had also encountered him, confirming our fears. He had been searching for us specifically. The feeling of being hunted, of knowing someone had been actively looking for us, added a deep, personal fear that was entirely different from the natural threats I had faced before. In Maine, the fear of nature itself became palpable around a campfire. A sudden crashing sound erupted from the woods, followed by the sight of a massive moose bursting from the trees and charging through the campsite. My heart hammered in my chest, adrenaline surging, and I sprinted to the van. The size and unpredictability of the animal reminded me that wilderness is not tame. Even in what feels like a controlled environment, danger can appear without warning. The moose disappeared back into the trees, leaving a silence that was just as jarring as the noise had been. And then, in the Rocky Mountains, a hike took on an almost surreal quality. Halfway through, we heard a high-pitched scream, distant but distinct, immediately bringing thoughts of cougars to mind. A few minutes later, my friend began laughing uncontrollably, and I turned to see her, spook herself. Then the laughter started to echo all around us, our voices amplified and repeated by the valley, bouncing back from the trees. Every sound became disorienting. We debated whether to turn back or press on. finally choosing the safer, more popular trail. The laughter faded, but faint echoes lingered whenever the trail emptied of people. That day, I learned how quickly the familiar could become strange, how the mind reacts to unknown sounds in isolation. All of these experiences taught me that fear in the wilderness comes in many forms: silence, predators, other humans, even natural forces, but each ended with clarity. I survived. I reached the huts, returned to the trailhead, avoided the predator, escaped the man, watched the moose run, and eventually found safety. In every case, preparation, awareness, and composure were key. Fear might accompany you, but it can be managed, faced, and ultimately left behind when the day ends and you step back into safety. The memory remains vivid, but it is no longer immediate. And with that comes a strange relief, a deep appreciation for the power of the wild and the resilience we carry within ourselves. I was walking my dog through the streets of Chelsea on a late afternoon that had that odd mix of warmth and chill that feels like the city itself is holding its breath. The sidewalks were crowded, tourists and locals moving in streams, each group forming its own chaotic rhythm. My English Mastiff, a massive, lumbering ball of fur and muscle, kept glancing over his shoulder, ears twitching, lips lifting in short, low growls when he saw something or someone I couldn't make out. At first, I shrugged it off. I figured he was just noticing a snack someone dropped, or maybe a particularly interesting smell, as dogs often do in the city. But the frequency of his glances and the intensity of his growls started to make me uneasy. We'd started from the park, weaving through the winding paths toward the more residential streets that led toward my apartment. At first, it was normal. We passed families with strollers, skateboarders, people walking with their own dogs. He'd stop, sniff the air, then glance behind us again. I laughed to myself, calling him stubborn and dramatic, but I noticed a figure further back, partly hidden behind a lamppost. A man, not particularly striking, but for some reason, my stomach tightened when I saw him. At first, it felt coincidental. New York streets are full of strangers. But the more we walked, the more I realized he wasn't just passing by. Every time we changed streets, he adjusted his path, always keeping a certain distance, never too close, but close enough to see us clearly. My dog's growls became deeper, almost warning me, and his gaze never wavered from that man. I tried to lose him. We took a sharp turn down a side street that was narrower, quieter, the sound of the city fading behind us. I figured the congestion had given him an easy way to blend in, but now the streets were more residential, lined with low buildings and small cafes. We slipped into an alley to cut back to another street, hoping maybe the maze of Chelsea would make him give up. But when I looked back, he was still there, moving closer, slow and deliberate. My dog tense beside me, pulling on a leash, growling, hackles raised. He was a massive dog, bigger than most people's frame, and his presence was intimidating, but my unease grew with every block. Why would someone be following me so persistently in plain daylight with a dog this size by my side? It made no sense. I spotted a restaurant I had been to before, one of those small, unassuming places with a glass front and a patio in the back. I made a decision without thinking too hard, just moving toward it, praying it was open. My dog stayed close, growling intermittently, scanning every shadow and corner. The man didn't hesitate. He continued walking toward us as we neared the restaurant. I ducked inside, the door closing behind me with a heavy thud that felt like a thin barrier between safety and the tension outside. I apologized to the hostess, explaining quickly, keeping my voice low and urgent, that we were being followed. The staff immediately moved, offering a corner table and access to the patio for my dog, who immediately laid down but remained alert, eyes tracking every movement. I called a friend, describing the situation in short, clipped sentences, making sure they understood where I was and that I needed someone to pick me up as quickly as possible. From the window, I could see him pause on the street, scanning the crowd outside, clearly trying to figure out where we had gone. He lingered a few moments, then walked on, not rushing, almost casually, as if waiting for us to emerge. My heart pounded against my ribs, a constant reminder of the vulnerability of being alone in a city full of people. The staff kept checking in, offering water for my dog, making small gestures of support, but I barely noticed. My focus was on the man outside, on my friend on the phone, on making sure we weren't seen leaving until it was safe. It took longer than I wanted, but eventually my friend arrived. I could see the car turn the corner, the familiar vehicle, a tiny slice of relief in the middle of the tension. I waited for him to park, keeping my dog calm, making sure to stay near the interior of the restaurant, out of sight. When we finally walked toward the car, my dog at my side, I saw the man pause, look our way, then turn down another street, seemingly uninterested now. We got in the car, doors locking behind us, and I sank into the seat, finally allowing myself to breathe. My dog rested his massive head on my lap, still alert but less tense. The drive home was quiet, just the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional bark at a distant siren or horn. When we finally reached my apartment, I double-checked the locks, watched my dog circle the living room before lying down completely, and let the tension drain out of my body. I never saw the man again, never understood why he had chosen to follow me. But I knew one thing, my dog had saved me. Without him, I don't even want to imagine what might have happened. That night, I slept with the apartment door locked and my dog beside me, a silent, protective guardian who had seen something I couldn't. The sense of relief was profound, a reminder that even in a city of millions, the right companion can make all the difference between fear and safety. Last summer, I went out for my early morning walk with my dog, a senior mutt who's been with me for over a decade. We live in a semi-rural area, surrounded by dense woods, a few hills, and the occasional ravine. Wildlife is everywhere here. Bears, coyotes, bobcats, and the occasional cougar are all part of daily life. Normally, this doesn't bother me. I grew up in the mountains, and encounters with wild animals have always been part of my routine. But that morning was different. There was a heavy fog rolling through the trees, softening the shapes and shadows around me. It was just past 5:30 a.m., cool and quiet, the kind of silence that feels almost thick in the air. My dog and I had done this walk countless times, and it was one of the few moments in the day where everything else didn't exist. I was about to speed up into a light jog when it happened. My dog stopped dead in the middle of the path, rigid as a statue. I called his name, moved toward him, and he didn't budge. His ears were pinned straight up, eyes fixed on the forested ravine that cut through the edge of our property, and his low growl started rumbling from his chest. I've seen him react to bears, coyotes, and the occasional fox in the past, but this growl was different, raw, sharp, filled with a kind of hatred or fear that I hadn't heard before. My stomach tightened. Then the sound came. At first, I couldn't place it. It was low, deep, resonant, almost like a growl mixed with a scream. It had no rhythm, no pattern, just a pure expression of rage or pain or both bouncing off the fog in the trees. It made my skin crawl and my knees go weak. The air seemed to vibrate with it. My dog's fur bristled, his hackles up, teeth bared, lips curled in a snarl, and he started spitting. I tried to see what he was looking at, but the fog swallowed the bottom of the ravine and the trees beyond it. There was nothing visible, but the sound was coming from deep inside those shadows. My first instinct was to stay calm. I've been around wildlife my entire life. I've heard cougars, bears, and even packs of coyotes, and I know the sounds they make. But this was something else. There was no question in my mind that it was dangerous. The sheer depth and raw power of the noise made the hair on my arm stand on end. It didn't belong to anything I had ever heard in these woods before. My dog was practically vibrating with fear, his old body tense and ready to bolt. I had to get him moving. I nudged him, called his name louder, and finally, with a firm kick in the side, not out of anger, but necessity, he ran. He tore down the path, and I followed, adrenaline pumping through my veins, heart hammering like a drum. The fog clung to my face, wet and cold, my feet slipping slightly on the damp ground, but I didn't look back. The sound faded behind us slowly, but but I could still feel it pressing against my chest, heavy and wrong. I made it to the edge of our property and slammed the gate closed behind us, then bolted up the driveway toward the house. My dog was already at the front window, rigid, ears alert, staring into the fog as if he could see whatever had made that noise. Inside, I collapsed into a chair, shaking, my heart still racing, sweat mixing with the chill in the air. My dog didn't move from the window, though his eyes flicked between the trees and the driveway. I tried to rationalize what had happened. A bear maybe, or a cougar, or even a pack of coyotes. But none of them made sounds like that. Cougars scream, bears roar, coyotes yip and howl. None of it ever reached the sheer low, violent, bone-deep growl that had filled the forest that morning. For hours, I stayed near the windows, checking the edge of the property, flashlight in hand, my dog at my side. The fog eventually lifted, revealing nothing unusual. No tracks, no broken branches, no signs of a creature larger than a deer or a coyote. I walked the path again later in the morning, carefully, with my dog on a tight leash. Nothing. The forest was calm and normal. Birds chirped, squirrels ran. The wind rustled through the leaves. But the memory of that sound stayed with me, echoing in my chest every time I closed my eyes. That morning changed the way I walked in the woods. I've never felt fear that deep before, not with bears, not with the snowstorms, not with the isolated hikes I've done in mountain passes. It wasn't just danger, it was wrongness. Something in that forest had made my dog react the way he never has before, and that instinctive fear, the kind you can't teach or fake, made my own instinctive caution surge. I've doubled my morning checks now, carry bear spray, even though I know how to handle wildlife, and I keep my dog closer than ever. I don't know what was in the fog that morning. I may never know, but I do know that whatever it wasn't a normal animal. And I do know that it taught me something important. In the forest, no matter how familiar it seems, respect and caution are always necessary. Even a lifetime of experience can't prepare you for the wrongness that comes out of nowhere, the kind that shakes you to your core and makes the world feel unstable for just a moment. That morning, I survived. My dog survived, and we've both stayed alert ever since, carrying the memory as a reminder that sometimes fear is not just instinct. It's a warning. I have been looking forward to this hike for weeks. My wife and I both love the outdoors, and our dog, a sprightly border collie mix named Luna, was always eager for an adventure. The plan was simple. Start at the well-known trailhead that led to a waterfall and swimming hole. Enjoy the scenery, and then, if we felt like it, continue past the waterfall into the less traveled parts of the forest. The first few miles were exactly what I had expected. People scattered along the trail, kids laughing as they ran to the water, dogs splashing in the pool at the bottom of the falls. The sound of the water rushing over the rocks mixed with the laughter made everything feel calm and perfect. Luna ran ahead, stopping occasionally to sniff, chase a butterfly, or roll in the soft dirt. She was in heaven. Once we reached the waterfall, we took a break. I checked our packs, made sure we had enough water, and looked up at the steep path leading further into the forest. It was rocky and uneven, a trail that clearly required some effort to continue. The climb was enough to keep most people from venturing beyond the falls, which is exactly what I wanted. I like the quiet that comes when the crowds thin out, the kind of silence where you can hear the forest breathing around you. We started up the steeper trail, Luna bounding ahead and occasionally stopping to look back at us, her tail wagging furiously. The further we went, the quieter it became. The sounds of people, laughter, and splashing faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, and the faint calls of distant birds. The air smelled damp and earthy, the kind of smell that only comes after a light morning rain. I felt good, energized by the climb and the peace of being deep in the woods. After a mile or so, the trail became narrow, winding between thick trees and dense underbrush. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in uneven patches, casting long shadows across the path. I noticed Luna slowing down slightly, sniffing the air more intently than before, but I didn't think much of it. Dogs often get distracted, especially in new environments. My wife walked a few steps behind me, her breathing steady but heavier than earlier, and I could tell she was starting to feel the climb. I didn't mind. She's tougher than she looks, but I made a mental note to keep the pace steady. Then it happened. Luna stopped abruptly, her body stiff, ears forward, and she froze mid-step. I could see the tension in her posture immediately. She wasn't just pausing to sniff or look around. She was terrified. Her eyes locked straight ahead, focused on something I couldn't see. She growled softly, low in her throat, and then backed up slightly, pulling against her leash. My wife and I exchanged a glance, confusion passing between us. I tried to see what she was seeing. The trail ahead was just trees and underbrush, shadows dancing across the dirt. There was no movement, no glint of eyes, no shape to suggest anything out of place. Luna started whining and tugging harder, trying to pull us back down the trail toward the waterfall. My stomach tightened. I've had Luna for 8 years, and I've never seen her act this way. She loves the forest, she loves hiking, she loves everything about this life we give her. But here she was frozen, scared, desperate to retreat from something I couldn't even identify. I called her name softly, trying to coax her forward, but she refused. Her legs were trembling, her paws digging into the dirt as if she wanted to anchor herself in the spot. My mind started racing with possibilities. There could be a bear or a coyote lurking just beyond the brush, though we hadn't heard anything. Maybe someone with bad intentions had ventured off the main trail. Maybe it was a snake or another animal we couldn't see. Every scenario, I imagined, made my chest tighten more. I looked at my wife, who was gripping the straps of her pack, her face pale. We didn't speak. No words were needed. We knew the right choice. I slowly took a step back, urging Luna to turn around, and she practically leapt onto the trail behind us, still whining but relieved to be retreating. We moved quickly but carefully, retracing our steps down the narrow, twisting path. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound amplified. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, even the call of a distant bird felt menacing. I kept scanning the trees on either side, my heart hammering, but we didn't see a thing. As we got closer to the waterfall, the forest opened up slightly. The familiar sounds of running water grew louder, and I could hear the distant laughter of people enjoying the swimming hole. Luna slowed, her ears dropping back and her tail wagging again as the danger, or whatever it was, faded. My wife let out a breath she didn't even realize she'd been holding. I felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. We didn't speak much as we descended the rest of the trail. We didn't try to go back the way we came. We left the main trail at the first safe junction and headed down a parallel route that looped back to the parking area. Luna walked calmly beside us now, occasionally looking back as if to confirm that nothing was following. I kept glancing over my shoulder too, scanning the trees for any sign of whatever had caused Luna's terror. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no eyes glinting in the shadows. When we finally reached the parking lot, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, golden streaks across the clearing. People were packing up, heading to their cars, laughing and chatting as if nothing had happened in the woods at all. Luna collapsed into the dirt, exhausted but happy again, tail wagging slowly as I knelt to scratch behind her ears. I couldn't shake the image of her frozen stance, her fear, the certainty in her gaze. I've thought about that hike countless times since then. I don't know what was ahead of us on that narrow, shaded trail. Maybe it was an animal we didn't see. Maybe it was something human. Maybe it was nothing at all. But Luna's reaction was unmistakable. Her instincts kept us safe. That day, I realized that sometimes, no matter how brave you think you are, listening to your dog can save your life. I don't hike that trail past the waterfall anymore. Not because I'm scared, but because I respect what I can't see, what I can't predict. And I am grateful to have a dog who understands the forest in ways I never could, and grateful that we walked away without a scratch, ready to enjoy the rest of our lives together, safer and wiser for the experience. I had only been a park ranger in the desert for a few months when I started learning that the job wasn't just long hikes, rattlesnake warnings, and the occasional lost hiker. The desert was quiet, vast, and unforgiving, and being alone in it made things feel larger than life. Every sound sharper, every shadow longer. One of the first real shocks came when volunteers called us about a smoldering car at one of the remote campsites. Stolen vehicles getting abandoned and set on fire wasn't unheard of, but when we drove out there, the smoke still curled lazily above the car, the smell of burning rubber and plastic heavy in the dry air. We parked a few yards away, waiting for the fire department to arrive, and just stood there, taking it in. Then it hit me, there was someone in the front seat. The body was slumped forward, almost lost in the shadows cast by the smoke, and at first I couldn't process it. Food wrappers, rope, and strange items were scattered in and around the car. Whoever had been there hadn't just died, they'd been bound and shot. The police came, handled the cleanup, and left with more questions than answers. The site became infamous among the small park staff. We even joked quietly, though nervously, about calling it the haunted site. It was the most visited spot in our tiny park, not for camping or hiking, but for people drawn to the grim story. Another incident stuck with me, though it wasn't mine to respond to. One of our office chiefs received a call from a man threatening suicide, claiming he had an arsenal of firearms and was ready to end it. He gave a location near the park, and 2 of my coworkers were dispatched to investigate. When they arrived, they were met by another ranger who had already found the man. She warned them to step back before getting caught in a mess that would take weeks of paperwork. The man had shot himself, badly enough that it wasn't immediately fatal, then tried to walk for help. When she found him, it was over, the aftermath leaving a scene that no one wanted to handle twice. I remember feeling a sick sort of sympathy for her. She had recently dealt with her own personal tragedy, discovering her husband, also a ranger, had killed himself. I couldn't imagine the weight of that kind of day on someone already carrying that kind of grief. It was a reminder that out here, in these parks that seemed endless and empty, people's darkest moments could surface without warning, and rangers sometimes had to be the ones to bear witness. By far, though, the scariest moment I had came during one of my quiet nights alone. I had recently moved into the area and was responsible for 2 parks, both closed to the public and situated about 30 miles from the nearest occupied house. Even those houses were often empty in the summer, leaving the desert utterly mine for the night. I decided to drive out to the darker of the 2 parks, a place with vast stretches of sand, creosote bushes, and hills that rolled into black silhouettes under the stars. I wanted to watch a meteor shower and practice my banjo. It seemed like a peaceful, almost idyllic way to spend the night. I pulled up to the picnic area, unloaded my gear, and settled onto the worn wooden table, strumming chords I barely knew. The air was dry, the heat from the day lingering in the sand beneath my boots. The sky stretched endlessly above, full of stars, and for a moment, I felt completely isolated but strangely at peace. Then the unease began. My mind, already prone to racing in these empty spaces, started whispering what-ifs. Was that a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the picnic lights? What if someone was out here watching me? The memory of the burned car park crept in uninvited. What if the people from that scene had returned? Every rustle of the wind through the scrub became sinister. My fingers hesitated over the strings, my ears straining. And then I heard it, muffled voices in the brush, quick little mumbles followed by the rustle of movement. My heart slammed in my chest, my neck prickling with cold sweat. The dark seemed to pulse, every small sound magnified, every shadow a potential threat. My eyes darted back and forth, trying to make sense of shapes in the black. The noises grew closer, high-pitched and fast, almost like children, and panic started to rise. I imagined headlines. Park ranger dies of heart attack. Found 3 days later, still clutching banjo. I felt frozen, unable to move, waiting for whatever it was to emerge. Then the reality hit. 3 coyotes burst through the creosote bushes, yipping and bounding with no concern for my presence. They passed close enough that I could see their lean, sandy bodies moving with effortless speed. their eyes reflecting the faint starlight. The sounds that had sent my heart racing were not people, not ghosts, not anything supernatural. They were coyotes, free to roam the desert without a hint of worry. The danger I had imagined was entirely my mind playing tricks on me in the empty, silent desert. I exhaled, slowly, relief washing over me. My fingers returned to the banjo. Though the notes sounded hollow now, the magic of the stars slightly diminished. I realized then that the desert was alive in ways I hadn't fully appreciated, but it wasn't haunted or cursed. It was real, wild, and could scare you just by existing in its emptiness and unpredictability. I packed up soon after, leaving the picnic table, the banjo, and the starlit sky behind. That night taught me a lesson about fear and isolation, about how the mind can take ordinary danger and twist into something monstrous when you are alone. I never played the banjo there again, not because of ghosts, but because I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that solitude in the desert has its own gravity. The parks, the burned car, the lonely stretches of sand, they were dangerous only in the ways the desert already was, remote, wild, and indifferent to human presence. And that was scary enough. I still remember that day in the Adirondacks with a clarity that surprises me. Early spring had just arrived, but it was too early for the trail crews to have started their usual cleanup. Branches, fallen logs, and old leaves still littered the path, making every step uncertain. I was hiking with my boyfriend at the time, though he's my ex now, and we had decided to do the loop trail around a lake. It was supposed to be relaxing, a simple walk to a waterfall we hadn't explored yet. The trailhead was a single point of entry and exit, which I didn't think much about at first, but later realized would matter more than I wanted it to. The morning had been chilly, with that crisp air that makes your lungs ache just a little when you breathe deeply. Snow was melting in patches, leaving soggy ground and thick, muddy bogs in places. The path was narrow, winding through dense trees, the branches scraping against our jackets as we went. We were about halfway to the waterfall, moving carefully because the trail was slippery when I first noticed it, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground. At first, I thought it was some animal moving far off in the woods, but then it got closer. The sound wasn't subtle. It was deliberate, heavy, like some massive creature stomping its way toward us. I froze, a pit opening in my stomach. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt stuck in mud and fear. Then came a sound that made my blood run cold, a bizarre, high-intensity growl that increased in pitch and volume so rapidly it didn't sound like anything I had ever heard in real life. It was exactly the kind of noise you hear in movies when some alien or monstrous creature appears on screen. My heart slammed against my ribs. I wanted to bolt, to throw myself over the uneven ground and leave that force behind, but the path behind us was just as treacherous. The mud, branches, and leftover snow patches made turning back almost as impossible as moving forward. I looked at him. He was trying to calm me, telling me to hold up, to think it through. But I couldn't breathe properly. Every inhale felt like fire, every exhale like water I couldn't escape. Panic rose in my chest, and my body demanded action. We couldn't turn around the way we came, not without slipping into icy bogs that threatened to swallow our boots. The only choice was forward, into a stretch of the trail that was notoriously difficult. The bog was worse than I remembered from maps and old photos. It sucked at our boots with every step, mud oozing around our ankles, pulling at us like some sticky trap. Roots tangled beneath the surface, hidden by half-frozen leaves, forcing us to lift our feet high or risk falling face first into the sludge. Every step was a struggle. Every movement felt slow, heavy, and exhausting. My boots were soaked, my socks squelching inside, the mud cooling and sticking, a constant, uncomfortable weight. The fear from a sound behind us made my pulse hammer in my ears, and I was hyper-aware of every small noise. The cracking of branches under weight, the splash of water from the bog, the hiss of air escaping between branches as we pushed past them. Finally, After what felt like hours, but was probably less than 20 minutes, we emerged from the worst of the bog. Our clothes were caked with mud, our boots nearly falling apart, and I was shaking uncontrollably. Relief crashed over me when I saw the trail leveling out, the trees opening up to where the loop was nearly complete. The waterfall, which had seemed like a serene destination earlier, was now nothing more than a blur in my exhausted brain. We pushed the last stretch, boots clinging to slippery soil, bodies tense with lingering fear. When we finally reached the car, the emotion I had been holding in, the fear, the adrenaline, the raw panic, escaped in tears. I was still shivering, my face wet and streaked, my clothes heavy with mud and water. I sat in the driver's seat, trying to calm down while the car's heater slowly warmed my chilled body. My stomach was still recovering from the previous day's food poisoning, adding a layer of nausea to the exhaustion and terror. Next vacation, we're going to city. I moped, feeling utterly drained. I had always loved nature, always found comfort in its quiet beauty, but this experience had left me with a profound sense of vulnerability. For vacations to the Adirondacks had always been my idea of peace, but now that peace was tainted with a memory of near panic and the humbling reminder that nature could terrify without warning. Years later, long after the relationship ended and the scars of that hike had faded into an uneasy laugh, I was listening to nature's sounds on the internet. Calm wind, rustling leaves, trickling water, things meant to soothe a restless mind. And then I heard it, the growl, that same strange, escalating sound that had paralyzed me in the woods. I froze, a chill running down my spine as my body recalled the terror of that day. My rational mind raced, and I learned something fascinating. It wasn't a monster, it wasn't some alien creature. It was a ruffed grouse, a bird, making its mating call while beating its wings against its chest. I laughed quietly, relief flooding me like warm sunlight after a storm. The thing that had made me run through mud and bog, terrified for my life, had been a bird all along. A horny bird. It was almost absurd, almost funny, but also humbling. I realized that my fear, my panic, my sweat, and tears, all of it, was a reaction to the unknown, to the unexpected. Nature didn't need to be supernatural to be terrifying. It just needed to be alive. That hike left me with more than a memory. It left a lesson. Fear is real, and it is powerful, but sometimes it is also misplaced. We had survived the trail, we had survived the mud and bogs, and we had survived the imagined threat of something monstrous. And in the end, all that remained was a story I could tell, a reminder that the world is full of surprises, sometimes terrifying, sometimes ridiculous, but always alive. And I learned to respect it, but also to laugh at it, at least a little. A few years ago, my brother and I decided to go camping in Colorado. It was early fall, the air was crisp and carried that dry, earthy smell unique to the mountains. We had picked a small clearing near a stand of willows by a creek, far enough from the main trail to feel like we had the place to ourselves, but not so far that we couldn't reach other campers if we needed help. The first night, everything was calm. The creek babbled gently in the background, leaves rustled softly in the wind, and the sky was full of stars. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones, the kind that makes every small sound seem louder than it is. Sometime late at night, I was half asleep in my sleeping bag when I felt the tent shake slightly. My brother was already awake, staring into the dark. He whispered, his voice tight with tension, that he had heard a twig snap nearby. I rubbed my eyes and reached for my headlamp. We didn't speak, but there was a shared understanding between us. Something was out there. Slowly, we turned on our headlamps and scanned the edge of the clearing where the willows grew thick. At first, I thought it was a bear. There was a huge pair of glowing eyes, fixed on us, unblinking. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink, they just stared. 4 or 5 full minutes we watched it, our hearts hammering, our bodies frozen with tension. Every instinct told me to stay calm, but my stomach knotted and my throat felt dry. We decided it was safer to pack up, and move closer to some other groups. We turned off our lights, trying not to make noise, and began to quietly unzip the tent. That's what happened. The bushes shook violently, and before I could process it, a massive moose came crashing out of the willows. Its antlers spread wide, scraping branches and sending leaves flying. My brother and I froze, caught in a heartbeat of absolute terror. The moose charged straight for us, nostrils flaring, hooves pounding the ground. Somehow, it veered at the last second, missing our tent by inches. It disappeared into the trees, leaving a trail of broken branches and a silence that felt deafening. We didn't move until we were sure it was gone, hearts racing, sweat running cold despite the chilly air. We packed what we could carry, grabbed our backpacks, and made our way toward other campers, making mental notes of every crackling branch and movement around us. A few weeks later, I went hiking on a trail I had hiked countless times with my dog. The trail was usually busy, but after a night of rain, the path was empty. The forest smelled wet and alive. Mud clung to my boots, and water dripped from the leaves above. My dog ran ahead, tail wagging, her paws leaving prints in the mud. Then, without warning, she froze 20 yards ahead, ears pricked, body stiff. I called her name, expecting her to come bounding back, but she didn't move. She turned sharply and ran back down the trail, ignoring my calls completely. I chased after her, heart pounding. The forest was quiet except for the soft squelch of mud beneath my boots and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. Then I noticed it, a print in the mud, massive and unmistakable. A mountain lion. The claws left sharp impressions, and the size of the paw made my stomach drop. My dog had sensed it long before I did. The realization hit me hard. We weren't just sharing the forest with deer and birds. There were predators here, moving silently, observing. I didn't run, not immediately. Running can trigger a chase instinct in big cats. Instead, I stayed calm, kept my dog close, and slowly started retracing her steps. Every step felt measured, careful. I kept my eyes on the print, noting the direction it had come from, aware that it could still be nearby. It took nearly 20 minutes to get back to the trailhead, and by the time we emerged, my dog was shaking slightly, but otherwise unharmed. I made sure she stayed on leash, never letting her run ahead again. That day left a mark on me. It was a reminder that no matter how familiar a trail or campground feels, the wilderness is unpredictable and indifferent. You're always a guest, always observed, always one small misstep away from danger. Since those incidents, I've approached the outdoors with a sharper awareness. I carry bear spray. I make noise when moving through dense brush. I watch for prints, scat, or broken branches that signal life around me. I respect the animals, the silence, the unpredictability. Every time I camp or hike, I think back to the glowing eyes in the willows, the moose charging, the mountain lion print in the mud. I think about how quickly everything can change, how close danger can be even in places that seem safe. Those experiences weren't terrifying because of ghosts or myths. They were terrifying because they were real, because the wilderness doesn't care who you are or what you know. You adapt or you pay the price. And I learned through trembling nights and cautious hikes that respect, preparation, and awareness are what keep you alive out there. That clarity, that lesson, is the ending that matters. After all, fear in the wild isn't a story. It's a reality you live, survive, and remember. By the time I stopped hiking for the day, I understood something vital. The wilderness is as beautiful as it is dangerous, and every sound, every shadow, every footprint is a story. The good ending isn't about escape from ghosts. It's about learning, surviving, and returning with a deeper respect for the life and power surrounding you. From then on, every hike and every camping trip carried that weight, that vigilance, but also a renewed appreciation for the raw, untamed world that exists just beyond the trail. The forest doesn't forgive mistakes, but it rewards caution, awareness, and respect. That's the reality I carry with me. And that's the clarity I finally understand after nights of staring at eyes in the dark and tracking prints in the mud. Hi there. I'm Samantha, though everyone calls me Sam. I was a park ranger for 6 years, and looking back, those years hold experiences that most people wouldn't believe if I told them. The first experience that truly shook me happened when I was still new, barely a junior ranger, still trying to prove myself. I think that day, more than anything, taught me that the woods hold dangers beyond anything you might expect from a trail map or a safety pamphlet. It started with a call about screaming coming from deep in the forest, not far from one of the busier trails. On any given day, hearing screams from the woods isn't unusual. Mountain lions can scream, foxes can scream, even hikers can scream when they fall or get spooked. But there was something about this call that made my stomach tighten. As I was gearing up to head out, my chief, a man with decades of experience, asked to come along. It struck me as odd. This seemed like a minor call, but I didn't argue. I figured maybe he wanted to check in on me, make sure I handled things properly. We set off, walking at a steady pace, the trail beneath our boots thick with fallen leaves and pine needles. The forest was alive with the usual sounds, birds, rustling branches, the wind through the canopy. But the deeper we went, the more those sounds seemed to fade. I was trying to make small talk, trying to mask the nervousness I felt in his presence, but he barely responded. Then he said something that stuck with me. Take even the small calls seriously. You'll never know what you'll find. At the time, it seemed like a simple piece of advice. I didn't realize how literal it was until later. The screams were just ahead, near the northern part of the trail. As we moved closer, the noise sounded eerily like a mountain lion, high-pitched and desperate, but there was something wrong with it. It wasn't a normal animal call. My stomach churned as we stepped off the trail and into the thicker trees, and then, almost as suddenly as it began, all sound vanished. The forest went completely silent. Not just muted silent. My ears, normally picking up every tiny snap and creak, heard nothing. My own breathing sounded muffled. I glanced at my chief. His face mirrored my fear, but there was a calmness in his eyes, a controlled awareness that I didn't have. Then the buzzing started. It wasn't like a fly or an electrical hum. It felt like it was vibrating through my bones, through my skull, through my entire body. My ears throbbed. My teeth felt like they were being jarred by a dental drill, and my vision began to flicker almost like static. Then I saw it. It stepped out from behind the trees, tall, at least 7 feet, and impossibly dark, its shape almost more shadow than solid. It didn't walk. It bent low, crawling toward us, and from its mouth, or maybe somewhere deeper, it emitted that same scream. My body froze. Instinct screamed for me to run, but my chief grabbed me. He gripped my arm tightly, then wrapped an arm around me, pinning my arms to my sides. I wanted to push him, scream, flee, but he said in a calm, steady voice, "Don't run. Don't talk. Don't look back. Just keep walking." I didn't understand, but I obeyed. Every step felt like moving through quicksand. Behind us, I could feel its presence, the vibration of its crawl, the faint echo of that scream reverberating through the forest. I wanted to break into a sprint, but the pressure of his grip and the tone of his voice kept me moving forward. 10 minutes felt like hours. I counted each step, each heartbeat, every nerve in my body screaming. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it seemed to retreat. The normal sounds of the forest returned, the buzzing stopped, and the oppressive weight lifted slightly. When we reached the main trail, my legs were trembling uncontrollably. I couldn't even form words. My chief released me, started walking back toward the ranger station without a word. I followed slowly, trying to make sense of what had happened, my mind racing. Finally, I yelled, demanding some explanation. He stopped briefly, glanced at me, and said, "There are things in these woods that have been here longer than us. Things we can't explain or control. If you can't handle that, you should pack your bags now." And then he kept walking. I didn't leave that day. I didn't leave for months after. I told myself that the woods were still beautiful, that the good moments outweighed the bad. But that experience stayed with me, etched into my memory. Every rustle, every distant scream, every vibration in the quiet moments of the forest reminded me of that day. Eventually, the accumulation of experiences like this became too much. I left the park, left the uniform behind, and tried to live a normal life. Looking back, I realized that first encounter was only a glimpse of the truth. The woods are not just quiet and peaceful places to hike. They're living, breathing ecosystems with layers of life that humans cannot fully comprehend. Some of what I experienced may never have a logical explanation, and some of it I choose not to seek one for. That day, I learned the value of restraint, of listening to experience, and of respecting the forest in a way I never had before. It was a hard lesson, but it was clear. The woods are full of hidden dangers, and surviving them sometimes isn't about strength or speed. It's about patience, awareness, and knowing when to obey those who have seen what you haven't. Even now, years later, I remember the feel of the buzzing, the silent weight pressing on me, and that impossible shadow crawling toward us. I know what I saw was real, even if no one else would ever believe it. I know it could have killed me if I hadn't listened. And I know that for all its beauty, the forest holds truths that humans are never meant to fully understand. I don't tell this to scare people. I tell it so they can respect it, and so they remember that sometimes surviving the woods is about more than just skill or courage. It's about understanding that some things are beyond our control, and our only choice is to endure and keep walking. I remember the morning like it was carved into my memory. The sun was just barely over the ridge, casting a weak golden light across the forest floor. I was stationed at one of the more remote entrances of the park, a stretch of wilderness where the trail forks into two paths, each leading deep into the heart of dense pine and fir trees. My shift started before dawn, and the air was crisp, carrying the sharp smell of damp earth and pine sap. I had my standard kit: radio, first aid bag, flashlight, map, compass, and my trusty Ranger truck parked on the dirt access road behind me. I pulled on my boots, laced them tight, and double-checked my gear, knowing that out here, even a small mistake could turn serious quickly. My task for the day was a routine patrol. The park had seen an uptick in visitors lately, and I was responsible for checking trails, maintaining signs, and ensuring that any hazards, fallen trees, washed out trails, or wildlife issues were noted and reported. At first, the morning was quiet. Birds chirped intermittently, and the occasional rustle of squirrels moving through the underbrush broke the silence. I moved at a steady pace, scanning the forest carefully. There was a rhythm to this work. You learn to notice the small things, the faint impressions of animal tracks in soft mud, the slight lean of a tree that might pose a hazard, the distant call of a hawk. Around mid-morning, I came across a section of trail that had been partially washed out during a recent storm. The soil was soft, and several roots jutted out at awkward angles, making it easy for someone to trip. I took out my camera and snapped a few photos, then marked the area with flagging tape, so other rangers would know to repair it later. While doing this, I noticed something unusual, a set of footprints running parallel to the trail. At first glance, they looked like a pair of hiking boots, but they were much deeper and larger than a normal hiker's print. The spacing suggested a heavy, slow-moving person, but there had been no other visitors reported in this sector that morning. Curiosity piqued, I decided to follow them for a short distance. The prints led off the trail into thicker forest, the trees growing closer together, their branches creating a dense canopy. Sunlight barely reached the ground here, and the air felt cooler. As I walked, the smell of damp wood and decomposing leaves grew stronger. There was an unsettling stillness in the forest, different from the normal hum of wildlife. Birds had stopped singing, and the usual rustle of small animals had vanished. I reminded myself to stay calm. This was my job. I was trained to handle unexpected situations. The tracks led to a small clearing where I spotted an abandoned campsite. The ground was flattened as if someone had recently slept there, and an old, battered backpack lay near a partially collapsed tent. The contents were scattered: a few empty cans, a broken flashlight, and a water bottle covered in dirt. Nothing seemed stolen, but the site was clearly used recently. I radioed the central office to report the find and waited for a response. The dispatcher advised me to stay put while they sent another ranger for support, but my instincts told me to check the area thoroughly. I started a careful sweep of the surrounding forest. The undergrowth was thick, and every step had to be deliberate to avoid tripping over hidden roots or slipping on loose soil. About 50 feet from the campsite, I found the source of the footprints. A man huddled behind a large boulder, looking thin, dirty, and exhausted. He wasn't aggressive, just wary, like he'd been hiding for a long time. I kept my distance, but spoke in calm tones, introducing myself and offering assistance. Slowly, he came out from behind a rock. His clothes were torn, and his shoes were practically worn through. He said nothing at first, only nodded when I offered water and food from my pack. I radioed again, explaining the situation. Within the hour, another ranger arrived with a first aid kit and some supplies. We led the man back to the park entrance, where local authorities were waiting. It turned out he had been missing for several days after getting lost on a backcountry trail. His family had reported him, and he had survived on minimal food and water, navigating through dense forest until he finally collapsed near the clearing. The relief in knowing he would be safe was immense. After ensuring he was in capable hands, I returned to the trail to finish my patrol. The sun was higher now, lighting the forest in bright, golden rays. I made notes of the washed-out trail and marked it for repair, but my mind lingered on the man I had found. Out here in this vast wilderness, it was easy to feel isolated, and survival depended on paying attention to every detail. The tracks in the mud, the subtle signs of movement, the way the forest itself seemed to guide or warn you. By the time my shift ended, I had walked nearly 20 miles, patrolled every trail in my sector, and returned to the ranger station exhausted but satisfied. That day reminded me why I love this work. It wasn't about grand adventures or dramatic rescues, though those moments happened. It was about vigilance, responsibility, and the quiet knowledge that the work you did mattered, sometimes in ways you couldn't immediately see. That evening, I drove home along the winding mountain road, watching the sun dip behind the peaks. The forest had returned to its usual stillness, but there was a sense of calm in it now. I knew that tomorrow I would be back, walking the same trails, looking for signs, listening to the whispers of the wilderness. And I also knew that being a park ranger wasn't just a job. It was a commitment to the land, the people who visited it, and to every life that crossed your path, no matter how lost or hidden they might be. This was a long day, but it ended with clarity and purpose. I had done my job, helped someone in need, and walked away with a renewed respect for the delicate balance of wilderness and human endurance. It was the kind of day that reminded me why the work mattered, why the vigilance was necessary, and why every step taken in those woods was a step toward keeping both the park and its visitors safe. I remember one particular summer that felt heavier than most, a season that taught me more about the land and myself than I ever expected. I was a park ranger in a sprawling national forest tucked into the Northern Rockies. The forest was vast, a tangle of firs, spruces, and pines, with narrow rivers carving their way through mossy banks and rocky gorges. I had worked the park for a few years, mostly handling routine patrols, trail maintenance, and helping lost hikers, but that summer, everything felt different. There was a certain weight in the air, a stillness that went beyond the usual calm of a forest. It began one early morning in late July. I had just finished checking the campgrounds for overnight visitors. Most campers had left by dawn, so the air smelled fresh, earthy, and wet from the night's dew. My routine was simple. Drive through the park in my old, rattling ranger truck, check the major trails, ensure that no fires had started, and make note of any wildlife activity. On that morning, my truck's engine hummed steadily as I took the back roads toward the higher elevations, where fewer people ventured. I felt a strange pull toward the less traveled trails, as though the forest was quietly coaxing me off the beaten path. Usually I resisted. Off-trail hikes were risky, and I had learned early that unmarked terrain could quickly become treacherous. But something made me slow the truck, park near a small creek, and lace up my boots. The trail, or rather, the path I created as I went, was narrow and uneven, covered with loose stones and thick underbrush. I moved carefully, scanning the forest for fallen branches, unstable ground, or signs of wildlife. Birds called from high branches, and the occasional deer leapt across my path, startled by my presence. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. No trucks, no distant hikers, no laughter echoing from a campground. Just a forest, dense and quiet. I felt a creeping tension, a sense that the woods were observing me, not maliciously, but with the impartial scrutiny of something that had existed far longer than I had. After a few hours, I reached a clearing I had never seen before. It was small, surrounded by towering trees, and in the center, the ground was flattened as if something heavy had rested there. I scanned the area carefully. No tracks, no remnants of campfires, no trash, just the marks in the dirt and a sense that this place was rarely visited. I checked my map. Nothing indicated a trail or a clearing in that exact spot. Curiosity gnawed at me, and despite my instincts warning otherwise, I decided to explore further. I followed a faint depression in the ground that led toward a ridge. The slope was steep, rocks loose beneath my boots, roots snaring my ankles with every step. Sweat soaked my shirt, and my lungs burned from the exertion, but I kept moving. About halfway up the ridge, I spotted an old, rusted metal box half buried in the dirt. Its lid was partially open, and inside, I could see what looked like remnants of old surveying equipment, some faded papers, and a coil of wire. The box was decades old, and judging by the condition, it had been left untouched for years. My heart raced, not from fear but from a thrill of discovering something hidden in a place no one seemed to visit. I carefully packed the papers and equipment back into the box and decided to carry it down to my truck. The descent was slower and more exhausting than the climb. Loose rocks shifted under my weight, and I had to stop several times to catch my breath. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I secured the box in the back of the truck and started the engine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had been watching me, waiting for me to stumble or turn back. It was a heavy, suffocating awareness, like the land itself had a presence I could feel in my bones. The next few days, I cataloged the contents of the box at the ranger station. The papers were old maps, mostly hand-drawn, detailing survey lines, creek courses, and notes about wildlife populations from decades past. There was nothing dangerous, nothing sinister. But the discovery reminded me how much the forest kept hidden from human eyes. People came and went, tourists hiked, campers camped, and yet so much remained untouched, preserved, and quietly thriving on its own terms. By the end of the week, I returned the box to the clearing, burying it in a safer, more concealed spot. It felt wrong to take it out of the forest entirely. That night, I sat at my small cabin on the edge of the park, looking at the trees swaying in the wind. The experience had left me with a deep respect for the forest, not just for its beauty, but for its patience, its hidden life, and its quiet resilience. It reminded me that even as a ranger, I was only a visitor, a temporary caretaker in a landscape that had existed long before me and would continue long after. From that summer onward, I carried a new awareness into every patrol. Every rustle in the leaves, every shadow across the trail, every quiet clearing I discovered was a reminder that the forest held secrets. Yes, but it also offered lessons. Patience, observation, respect. I never went off trail without a purpose again, and I began to document small features of the forest that often went unnoticed: fallen logs, animal tracks, tiny streams. In the end, that summer taught me that being a park ranger was not just about protecting the land from outsiders or enforcing rules. It was about understanding, listening, and moving carefully within a world that, while silent, had its own language. Even years later, when I walk through that forest, I can still feel the ridge beneath my feet, the weight of the trees around me, and the quiet pulse of life that has nothing to do with human schedules. It is a place alive in its own way. And I learned that the best way to serve it is simply to notice, to respect, and to keep its stories alive. I started my shift just as the sun was rising, the orange glow creeping over the peaks of the mountains surrounding the park. There is a crisp chill in the air, the kind that wakes you up and reminds you that winter is still clinging to the higher elevations, even though the lower valleys were starting to see signs of spring. My truck was parked near the ranger station, the engine cold and the tires still dusted with the gravel from yesterday's patrol. I checked my gear methodically: radio, first aid kit, binoculars, flashlight, maps, and my patrol notebook. Every item had its place, and I liked it that way. Even after years of patrolling, the routine gave me a strange sense of comfort. The first task of the day was to check the trailheads. Winter storms had left debris all over the backcountry trails, and hikers were starting to return in numbers. I wanted to make sure nothing dangerous had been left behind: fallen trees, washed out sections, or slick patches of ice that hadn't melted. The first trail I checked led up to a small ridge that overlooked a narrow valley. From the parking lot, it looked peaceful, but as soon as I started hiking, the smell of wet earth and pine hit me, heavy and sharp. The path was slippery, and I had to place each foot carefully. A large tree had fallen across the middle section, and I had to climb over the jagged branches, careful not to tear my jacket or fall. I made a note in my notebook to mark it for removal by the maintenance crew. After that, I moved to another trail that ran along the edge of a creek. The snow had melted unevenly, leaving puddles and mud pits that were deep enough to swallow a boot. I stepped carefully, testing the ground with my pole before moving forward. Birds were beginning their morning chorus, flitting between the bare branches. I paused for a moment to watch a pair of robins chase each other along the bank. Even in routine patrol, moments like these reminded me why I love this job. Mid-morning, I headed to check the park's backcountry campsite near the far end of the forest. It was about 5 miles from the ranger station, and the only way to reach it was by a narrow dirt road that twisted up and down the hills. The road had been damaged by recent storms, and I had to navigate around washed-out areas and loose rocks. I could hear the roar of a distant creek far below, swollen from snow melt. The forest around me was thick and shadowed, a mix of pines and bare deciduous trees. The light filtering through the branches created patterns on the ground, almost hypnotic if you stared too long. When I arrived at the campsite, I found signs that someone had stayed recently. A small fire pit had ashes in it, and there were footprints leading down toward the creek. No one was there now, and there was no trash, which was a relief. I always hated finding littered campsites. I spent some time inspecting the surrounding area for hazards. One of the tents left behind had a tear in the rainfly, and I documented it for removal. A large branch had fallen dangerously close to the sleeping area, and I marked it in my notebook to inform the maintenance crew. By mid-afternoon, I had covered most of my patrol area, but I still had one more route to check: the ridge trail that ran along the northern edge of the park. This trail was steeper and more isolated, and it had a few sections prone to rock slides. I drove as far as I could along the dirt road, then hiked the remaining half-mile. The wind had picked up, and I could feel it pressing against me, cold and persistent. My boots sank into soft patches of melting snow, and I had to be careful not to slip. About halfway along the ridge, I noticed something unusual: a patch of ground that looked disturbed, like someone had tried to dig. There was no one around, and the tracks were fresh. I examined them carefully. They weren't animal tracks, they were human. The soil had been shifted recently, the impressions clear and deep. I took photographs for the report, then checked the surrounding area for more signs. The ridge was isolated, with steep drops on one side and dense forest on the other. It wasn't a place people normally wandered, which made the disturbance unsettling. I made a note to report it to the park supervisor later, but for now, I had to finish the patrol. As I descended the ridge, the sun started to lower behind the mountains. Shadows stretched long and dark across the forest floor. The air was quiet, except for the occasional bird call and the distant sound of the creek. I paused for a moment, letting the stillness sink in. There was a satisfaction in completing the day's work, even when it involved unexpected discoveries or minor hazards. I felt a sense of accomplishment as I returned to my truck, muddy and tired but content. On the drive back to the station, I reflected on the day. Everything had been routine, mostly, but the disturbed patch on the ridge reminded me that even in places where few people ventured, there was always the potential for surprises. By the time I reached the station, the sky was painted in shades of pink and purple. I washed the mud off my boots, logged my patrol in the station's records, and checked the maps one last time planned for tomorrow. Everything was in order, and I could leave knowing the park was safe for the visitors who would come in the following days. Being a park ranger wasn't about heroics or dramatic rescues every day. It was about attention to detail, diligence, and respect for the environment. It was long hours, dirty boots, and quiet victories. That day had been like many others, long, demanding, and full of small but important tasks. And in the end, I felt that steady satisfaction of work done well, of a forest watched over, paths cleared, hazards noted, and the peace of the park preserved for the people who would come after me. I remember the day like it was yesterday, even though it happened years ago. I was a park ranger in a sprawling national forest, a place where the trails could twist for miles without seeing another human being. I had just started my morning patrol, my truck bumping along the dirt roads that wound between thick pine stands and open meadows. The air was crisp, the kind that makes your lungs feel wide and alive, and the sun was only just beginning to slip through the treetops, painting everything in long, golden streaks. I love mornings like this. Quiet mornings meant I could really see the forest, hear it, and feel it in a way you never could when the park was full of hikers, campers, and weekend visitors. That morning, I was scheduled to check on some remote areas that didn't get visited often. There had been reports of a few downed trees blocking trails after the last storm, and I needed to see if they were causing issues for hikers or wildlife. I loaded my pack with essentials: a chainsaw, a first aid kit, maps, radio, and some food, and started down one of the narrower service roads that led into the backcountry. The further I went, the more isolated it felt. The road narrowed even more until it became little more than a dirt track, flanked by towering pines and old oaks. Sunlight barely made it through the thick canopy, leaving shadows that moved with the wind, giving the forest a slow, breathing presence. As I hiked, I kept my eyes on the ground, checking for hazards and marking the spots where trail maintenance would be needed. I passed a small creek that was swollen from recent rains. Its water gurgled over rocks, making a peaceful, rhythmic noise. I leaned down to touch it, and the coldness of the water shocked me awake, reminding me that nature wasn't tame, no matter how familiar it seemed. Continuing onward, I reached an area where several trees had fallen across the main path. The storm had been fierce, and the wind had uprooted some massive trunks. I worked methodically, chainsaw buzzing, cutting the trees into manageable sections and rolling them off the trail. I made notes in my field journal about the exact location and size of each blockage. This was part of the job that no one outside the park office really appreciated, the quiet, tedious labor that kept the forest accessible and safe for everyone. Hours passed. I worked under the canopy, moving carefully, occasionally stopping to listen to the forest around me. There was a deer grazing in a clearing a few hundred yards away, its ears flicking at every sound. Birds called to each other from high in the branches, and somewhere, a woodpecker hammered steadily at a tree. The isolation was heavy, but comforting, a reminder of why I became a park ranger in the first place. I was in my element, surrounded by life, yet completely alone, able to observe the balance of everything without interference. I stopped for lunch near a ridge that overlooked a valley. The sun was higher now, cutting through the treetops and warming my back. I opened my pack and pulled out a sandwich and a bottle of water. As I ate, I noticed something unusual, a series of tracks along the ridge leading down into a thicket. They were large, definitely human, and recent. I frowned. This wasn't a place where many people went, and there were no signs of campsite or fire. I noted the tracks in my journal, always cautious about following them alone. Something in my gut told me to keep moving along the trail I was assigned and report the tracks later. By mid-afternoon, I reached the final section of trail I had planned to inspect. Here, the terrain became steeper, rocky, and harder to navigate. I moved carefully, using my trekking pole to steady myself. The area was remote, so cell service was non-existent, and even my radio was spotty. Every step required attention. One wrong move could send me sliding down the slope. I found more down branches and cleared them, leaving the trail safer than I found it. While working, I spotted an old, rusted car abandoned off the trail, half buried in leaves and underbrush. It was odd, but not entirely unheard of. People sometimes left vehicles in remote areas when they couldn't get them out. I noted its exact location and made a plan to report it so park authorities could investigate. As the sun began to lower, shadows stretched longer and the forest began to darken quickly. I packed up my equipment and started heading back toward the main road. The shadows made the familiar trail feel different, almost alien. Rocks seemed sharper, tree trunks closer together, the sound of twigs snapping under my boots louder. I stayed alert, careful to avoid tripping, but also aware of the natural noises, the rustle of squirrels, the whisper of the wind through the branches. I reminded myself that being cautious didn't mean being afraid. It meant respecting the wilderness. I finally reached my truck just as the last light faded from the sky. I brushed off the dirt and leaves from my clothes and loaded my gear. Driving back along the winding forest road, I reflected on the day. The work had been hard but fulfilling. I had cleared trails, documented potential hazards, and kept the forest safer for visitors and wildlife. There was satisfaction in that, a quiet pride that came from being alone with the land and leaving it in better shape than I found it. When I returned to the ranger station, I filed my reports, including detailed notes about the abandoned car, the tracks, and the areas where the trail needed maintenance. I double-checked the maps and made plans for the next patrol. By the time I left, night had fully settled over the forest, and the distant sounds of animals called from the trees. I felt a deep, calm exhaustion, a reminder that a day spent doing honest, important work in the heart of nature, no matter how tiring, was never wasted. That night, as I lay in my small ranger quarters, I thought about the forest, its quiet power, and the small ways I could help protect it. There were no heroes, no drama, no supernatural forces, just careful observation, hard work, and respect for the world around me. And somehow, that was enough. It always had been, it always would be. I remember the morning like it was yesterday, even though it happened years ago. I was on one of my routine patrols in the park, the kind of day that starts quietly but can shift in an instant. The sun was low, spilling light over the ridge lines, and the air was crisp, carrying the earthy smell of pine and damp soil. The trails were quiet, too quiet for a weekend, but the park had been seeing fewer visitors lately. I drove slowly along the winding dirt roads, listening to the hum of my truck and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The forest always feels alive, even when no one is around, and there's a strange comfort in that constant quiet. I had a few things to check that day. The old observation tower on the north ridge, a fallen tree that had been reported blocking a service road, and some erosion issues near the riverbank. The observation tower was always my first stop because it gave me a good view of the entire park. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The trail leading up to it was disturbed. The dirt scraped in a way that didn't look natural. I slowed the truck and got out. The tracks were deep, fresh, and spread across the narrow path, heading off into the woods. They weren't deer tracks or bear tracks. The prints were too large for a person walking normally, but not quite heavy enough for any large animal I knew. I took a picture with my phone and marked the spot in my notebook. Whatever it was, it had passed through recently. I didn't know what, and I didn't like it, but I had other duties to cover. By midday, I was at the service road, where massive pine had fallen across the path. I spent hours cutting it into sections, clearing the debris so park vehicles could get through. The chainsaw roared through the trees, and the smell of sawdust mixed with the forest air. While I worked, I kept my eyes on the edge of the woods. I had an instinct, an unease that wouldn't let me settle. The forest was too still, the birds too quiet. I finished clearing the tree just as the sun started dipping behind the mountains, long shadows stretching across the dirt road. The last task was the riverbank. Rain had been heavy the week before, and the water level was high. I walked carefully along the bank, inspecting the erosion and placing sandbags in vulnerable spots. I knew the river could be unpredictable. The ground was soft, wet under my boots, and each step left a clear impression. As I worked, I heard a sudden snapping of branches behind me. I froze. The sound wasn't far, but it wasn't close either, somewhere in between, moving through the undergrowth. I waited, listening. The air was heavy and still. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I tightened the straps on my backpack and decided it was time to head back to the ranger station before dark. The drive back was tense. I kept glancing into the trees, expecting to see something that wasn't there, and the sun dipped lower, turning the sky a dark orange. The road narrowed, winding along cliffs and dense forest. My headlights cut through the gathering shadows, but there were patches of darkness where nothing showed, where I couldn't see more than a few feet. I had been through these roads 1,000 times, but tonight every turn felt like the first. About 20 minutes from the station, my radio crackled to life. Another ranger reporting a hiker stranded on a trail near the old bridge. I made a mental note and turned the truck around. The bridge wasn't far, but it was tricky terrain, steep, uneven, and with loose rocks along the trail. I parked at the trailhead and took my flashlight and first aid kit. The woods were dense here, and the path was narrow. I moved carefully, scanning the shadows, my boots crunching over loose leaves. I reached the bridge and saw the hiker, an older man, exhausted and shaken, sitting on the edge of the path. He had twisted his ankle and couldn't move. I knelt beside him, checking the injury. It wasn't broken, but he couldn't walk on it. I lifted him carefully into a makeshift carry using my pack straps and my own strength, moving slowly and deliberately along the uneven trail. The forest seemed to press in around us, every sound amplified. The rush of the river below, the whistle of wind through the trees, the distant crack of a falling branch. My heart pounded with the strain and the tension. It took over an hour to get him safely to the truck. By the time we reached the station, night had fully fallen. The sky was deep black, the stars barely visible through the thick canopy. I checked him into the first aid room, made sure he was comfortable, and filed a report. Everything was recorded, the tracks, the noises, the twisted ankle. Nothing supernatural, nothing unexplained, just the raw, unpredictable reality of the wilderness and the responsibility of keeping people safe in it. As I sat back in my chair, exhausted, I realized the weight of what the job really meant. Being a park ranger wasn't about adventure or heroism. It was about awareness, patience, and the quiet persistence of facing the wilderness every day. It was about noticing the subtle signs, the tracks, the quiet, the shadows, and using that knowledge to prevent accidents, to help people, to manage the raw force of nature that didn't care about anyone's plans. That night, I understood more deeply than ever that my role wasn't just to patrol or enforce rules. It was to be the link between human safety and the unpredictable wild. I closed my notebook, turned off the lights, and listened to the wind outside. It was a long night, but the park was safe, and that was all that mattered. I had been working as a park ranger in the Rockies for almost 5 years when one of the most grueling weeks of my life occurred. It was mid-September, the time when the forests were a mix of gold and deep green, and the air carried the crispness of approaching winter. Most of the park's visitors had thinned out by then, leaving the trails quiet except for the occasional hiker or the distant call of a bird. The solitude was normally a comfort, but that week it became a pressure pressing on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The week started on Monday, when a sudden storm swept through the northern part of the park. I was on patrol when the clouds rolled in. They came fast, a dark wall moving over the mountains. and I could feel the first fat drops of rain hitting my jacket before I could reach shelter. I pulled over near a clearing that overlooked a narrow valley, hoping to wait it out, but the wind picked up sharply, rattling the windows of my truck. Trees started bending under the gusts, and I realized I had no time to just sit and wait. I grabbed my emergency pack, which I always kept ready for situations like this, and ran a short distance into the tree line, finding a large, low-hanging pine that I could crouch under. The rain lashed at my face, soaking my uniform, and the cold seeped into my bones. I watched the storm rage across the valley, the water flowing in sheets down the rocky slopes, carrying branches and leaves with it. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly nature could turn against you, and I made a mental note to check the trails and small bridges after the storm passed. By Tuesday morning, the storm had moved east, leaving behind mud-slick trails and fallen trees. I spent hours walking those trails, clearing small debris and marking dangerous spots with bright orange tape. I discovered a few hikers who had ignored warning signs and gotten stuck in a section of the trail that had turned into a shallow creek. They were soaked and exhausted, but unharmed. Guiding them back to the main road required patience, as the mud made every step treacherous. I was exhausted by the time I returned to the ranger station, yet I couldn't rest long because my supervisor had scheduled me for a night patrol that evening. The night patrols were always the most challenging. Even when everything seemed quiet, there was a constant tension in the back of your mind. Fallen rocks, loose soil, or a stray animal could turn a simple drive into a life-threatening situation. That night, I drove along the winding mountain roads, headlights cutting through the thick darkness. Fog had settled in low over the valleys, making it impossible to see beyond 50 feet. I slowed the truck to a crawl, scanning the sides of the road for any sign of trouble. Around 11 o'clock, I noticed a section where the fog was denser and a large tree had fallen across the edge of the road. Its roots were half up in the air, and its trunk sprawled across the shoulder. I got out with my flashlight, my boots sinking slightly in the wet soil, and examined the situation. The tree wasn't fully blocking the road yet, but if another storm hit, it could topple completely. I marked the spot with reflective cones and made a note to bring a chainsaw during daylight hours. By Wednesday, I had a hike off trail to inspect a remote section of the park that had been reported to have rock slides from a storm. The terrain was steep and jagged, and I moved carefully using my trekking poles to balance on the slippery rocks. At one point, I had to cross a narrow ledge that ran along a drop of nearly 60 feet. The wind gusted unpredictably, and I gripped the rock face with both hands, feeling the rough stones scrape my palms. I could see the valley below, thick with fog and shadow, and a herd of deer moving silently along the lower slopes. It was breathtaking, but the danger was real. One misstep, and I could have been seriously injured. The days blended into one another, each bringing new tasks and small emergencies. I had to inspect broken fences, check water levels in streams that had been swollen by rain, and retrieve lost camping equipment from remote areas. On Friday morning, I climbed to a ridge that offered a view of the central part of the park. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the peaks and valleys. I sat on a boulder, exhausted, and watched the mist curl around the mountains. The silence was deep, broken only by the occasional bird call or the distant rumble of a rock slide. I realized in that moment how much responsibility the park carried. I wasn't just walking trails or clearing debris. I was safeguarding people, animals, and the fragile balance of the ecosystem itself. By the weekend, everything had settled. The trails were cleared, fallen trees removed, and the park's visitors returned in small numbers. I drove along the main road one last time that week, reflecting on what had happened. I was physically drained, my muscles sore from climbing, lifting, and walking for hours each day, but I felt a profound satisfaction. Despite the storms, the fog, and the constant challenges, I had made it through. I had prevented injuries, mitigated hazards, and ensured the park remained a safe place for everyone. That week taught me the subtle truths of being a park ranger. It wasn't heroic in a flashy sense, but the work mattered. Every fallen branch I cleared, every mud-covered trail I inspected, every lost hiker I guided to safety, it all added up. By Sunday evening, I returned to the ranger station, tired but content. I cleaned my equipment, checked the radios, and made my notes for the following week. Sitting at the desk, looking out at the last light of the day, settling over the mountains, I understood something I hadn't before. The park wasn't just land. It was responsibility, patience, and perseverance. And though it demanded a lot, it also gave a quiet kind of fulfillment that stayed with you long after the week was over. I locked the station for the night and walked back to my small cabin nearby, the mountains looming behind me like silent, patient guardians. I slept deeply that night, knowing the park was safe, at least for now, and that the work I did mattered in ways that didn't make headlines but were essential all the same. I started my shift before dawn, the forest still shrouded in the deep, quiet darkness that only comes in the mountains. The air was crisp and sharp, the kind that makes your lungs wake up and your skin sting just slightly. My truck rattled along the gravel road, headlights cutting swaths through the mist that clung to the pines and firs like a heavy, damp blanket. As a park ranger, most of my work was routine, checking trails, ensuring no fires were started, inspecting campsites, monitoring wildlife, and occasionally rescuing hikers who overestimated themselves or underestimated the wilderness. But that morning, something about the forest felt different. Not threatening exactly, just watchful, like the trees themselves were aware of my presence. I parked at a small clearing near the edge of the main trail, grabbed my ranger pack, and started the morning patrol on foot. The crunch of my boots against frost-hardened dirt echoed in the stillness. Every so often, a crow or a jay would break the silence, but otherwise, it was just the wind whispering through the high branches. I carried my binoculars and field notebook, intending to log signs of wildlife activity, deer tracks, rabbit burrows, perhaps a bear scat here and there. Early mornings like this were my favorite, even if they came with the inconvenience of near-freezing temperatures and dew-soaked clothing. There's something about being completely alone in the forest that feels like a privilege, a rare kind of quiet that doesn't exist anywhere else. About an hour in, I noticed a narrow, overgrown path that branched off from the main trail. It wasn't one I had seen marked on any of the official maps, but over the years, people have been carving side paths into the forest, sometimes for hunting, sometimes just for wandering. My curiosity nudged me, and I decided to follow it for a bit, careful to mark my starting point in case I needed to backtrack. The path wound through thick undergrowth, the canopy above letting in little light. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I passed a fallen log, its surface slick with moss, and a small creek trickled nearby, the sound muted under layers of ice and leaves. Every so often I spotted animal tracks, coyote, deer, maybe a bobcat, but no humans. The forest seemed untouched here, and that was both exciting and grounding. I continued along the trail for maybe 45 minutes. The path narrowed further and twisted over small hills. Sunlight started to filter through the trees in long, slanted beams, revealing patches of frost that glimmered like crushed glass on the forest floor. That's when I noticed something unusual, an old, rusted vehicle half buried in ferns and vines. It was a small pickup, maybe 20 years old, with faded blue paint. The tires were flat, the windshield cracked, and moss had begun claiming the hood. Clearly, no one had used it in a long time. My instincts as a ranger kicked in immediately. Vehicles left abandoned in the park could be a hazard, and more importantly, I needed to make a note for the maintenance crew to remove it. But as I circled the truck, I realized the surrounding area was strangely clear of footprints or signs of recent human activity. Only the faint impressions of animals were visible: squirrels, raccoons, deer, but no people had been here recently. Curiosity became caution. I decided to inspect the vehicle more closely. The doors were rusted shut, and the inside was filled with decaying leaves and twigs. There were remnants of what might have been camping supplies, an empty thermos, a tattered blanket, but nothing of value or immediate danger. It looked like someone had left it there decades ago, and nature had slowly reclaimed it. I made detailed notes and took photographs for the park files. Even though the place was deserted, I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been watching this spot at some point, and that feeling lingered longer than I liked. After logging the vehicle, I retraced my steps back to the main trail. The forest seemed to open up gradually, sunlight stronger now, warming the damp soil and leaves. Birds were more active, calling and fluttering from branch to branch. The tension in my shoulders eased. I continued my patrol along the main trail, checking the bridges over the creek, ensuring the signage was intact, and marking any downed branches that could obstruct hikers. Each observation, each small task grounded me. There is a rhythm to this work, a sequence that makes you feel connected to something larger, something enduring. By mid-morning, I had covered several miles of trail, my notebook filled with observations, and my camera card loaded with wildlife shots. As I started heading back toward my truck, I saw a young buck grazing near the edge of the trail. He froze when he noticed me, ears twitching, and then bolted gracefully into the trees. That fleeting encounter reminded me why I did this job. Not for adventure or danger, but to preserve moments like this, moments where the forest breathes, unspoiled by human interference. I returned to my truck, wiped the sweat and dirt from my brow, and took a deep breath, inhaling the pine-scented air. The day was fully awake now, sunlight painting golden streaks across the canopy. I knew there would be more patrols, more work, but that morning, that quiet, that discovery of the abandoned truck reinforced why I stayed in this job. It was hard, sometimes lonely, but it was real. The forest was unpredictable, demanding, and full of surprises, but it was alive, and I was lucky to witness it. By the time I drove back to the ranger station, the day had warmed enough that frost no longer clung to the windshield. I unloaded my gear, cataloged my notes, and submitted my report about the vehicle. It was routine paperwork, but it also meant the forest was safer, cleaner, and better understood for those who would come after me. That's the part of the work that matters, the quiet impact you have on land. And even though the day had started with an eerie silence, it ended with clarity, purpose, and a profound appreciation for the simple act of walking among the trees. I locked the station doors behind me, tired but content, knowing I had done my part to protect a place that could take care of itself, but thrived all the more because someone was watching out for it. I remember the morning like it was yesterday, even though it happened years ago. I was on one of my routine patrols in the park, the kind of day that starts quietly but can shift in an instant. The sun was low, spilling light over the ridge lines, and the air was crisp, carrying the earthy smell of pine and damp soil. The trails were quiet, too quiet for a weekend, but the park had been seeing fewer visitors lately. I drove slowly along the winding dirt roads, listening to the hum of my truck and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The forest always feels alive, even when no one is around, and there's a strange comfort in that constant quiet. I had a few things to check that day. The old observation tower on the north ridge, a fallen tree that had been reported blocking a service road, and some erosion issues near the riverbank. The observation tower was always my first stop because it gave me a good view of the entire park. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The trail leading up to it was disturbed, the dirt scraped in a way that didn't look natural. I slowed the truck and got out. The tracks were deep, fresh, and spread across the narrow path, heading off into the woods. They weren't deer tracks or bear tracks. The prints were too large for a person walking normally, but not quite heavy enough for any large animal I knew. I took a picture with my phone and marked the spot in my notebook. Whatever it was, it had passed through recently. I didn't know what, and I didn't like it, but I had other duties to cover. By midday, I was at the service road, where a massive pine had fallen across the path. I spent hours cutting it into sections, clearing the debris so park vehicles could get through. The chainsaw roared through the trees, and the smell of sawdust mixed with the forest air. While I worked, I kept my eyes on the edge of the woods. I had an instinct, an unease that wouldn't let me settle. The forest was too still, the birds too quiet. I finished clearing the tree, just as the sun started dipping behind the mountains, long shadows stretching across the dirt road. The last task was the riverbank. Rain had been heavy the week before, and the water level was high. I walked carefully along the bank, inspecting the erosion and placing sandbags in vulnerable spots. I knew the river could be unpredictable. The ground was soft, wet under my boots, and each step left a clear impression. As I worked, I heard a sudden snapping of branches behind me. I froze. The sound wasn't far, but it wasn't close either, somewhere in between, moving through the undergrowth. I waited, listening. The air was heavy and still. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I tightened the straps on my backpack and decided it was time to head back to the ranger station before dark. The drive back was tense. I kept glancing into the trees, expecting to see something that wasn't there, and the sun dipped lower, turning the sky a dark orange. The road narrowed, winding along cliffs and dense forest. My headlights cut through the gathering shadows, but there were patches of darkness where nothing showed, where I couldn't see more than a few feet. I had been through these roads 1,000 times, but tonight every turn felt like the first. About 20 minutes from the station, my radio crackled to life. Another ranger reporting a hiker stranded on a trail near the old bridge. I made a mental note and turned the truck around. The bridge wasn't far, but it was tricky terrain, steep, uneven, and with loose rocks along the trail. I parked at the trailhead and took my flashlight and first aid kit. The woods were dense here, and the path was narrow. I moved carefully, scanning the shadows, my boots crunching over loose leaves. I reached the bridge and saw the hiker, an older man, exhausted and shaken, sitting on the edge of the path. He had twisted his ankle and couldn't move. I knelt beside him, checking the injury. It wasn't broken, but he couldn't walk on it. I lifted him carefully into a makeshift carry using my pack straps and my own strength, moving slowly and deliberately along the uneven trail. The forest seemed to press in around us, every sound amplified. The rush of the river below, the whistle of wind through the trees, the distant crack of a falling branch. My heart pounded with the strain and the tension. It took over an hour to get him safely to the truck. By the time we reached the station, night had fully fallen. The sky was deep black, the stars barely visible through the thick canopy. I checked him into the first aid room, made sure he was comfortable, and filed a report. Everything was recorded, the tracks, the noises, the twisted ankle. Nothing supernatural, nothing unexplained, just the raw, unpredictable reality of the wilderness and the responsibility of keeping people safe in it. As I sat back in my chair, exhausted, I realized the weight of what the job really meant. Being a park ranger wasn't about adventure or heroism. It was about awareness, patience, and the quiet persistence of facing the wilderness every day. It was about noticing the subtle signs, the tracks, the quiet, the shadows, and using that knowledge to prevent accidents, to help people, to manage the raw force of nature that didn't care about anyone's plans. That night, I understood more deeply than ever that my role wasn't just to patrol or enforce rules. It was to be the link between human safety and the unpredictable wild. I closed my notebook, turned off the lights, and listened to the wind outside. It was a long night, but the park was safe, and that was all that mattered. I started my shift just as the pale light of early morning was creeping over the pine-covered ridges. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of damp soil and pine resin, and the trails were still empty except for the occasional squirrel or chipmunk darting through the underbrush. My park was vast, stretching over miles of mountains, valleys, and forested ridges, and part of my job was to make sure everything ran smoothly. No lost hikers, no illegal campfires, no dangerous wildlife encounters, and no accidents that could have been prevented. I drove my Ranger truck along the dirt service road, the tires crunching over loose gravel. The sun was climbing higher, turning the mist that lingered over the valley into a soft golden haze. I checked the trailheads as I went, making mental notes of parking lot conditions, the state of the trash bins, and whether any broken signs needed repair. One of the more remote trailheads caught my attention. Its small wooden sign was leaning, almost hidden behind an overgrown bush. I made a note to fix it on my next maintenance run. By mid-morning, I had completed a loop through several high-elevation trails and stopped near a small creek to refill my water and take a brief break. The creek was shallow, with clear water trickling over smooth stones, and it sparkled in the sunlight. I knelt to fill my bottle, listening to the low hum of the forest, the wind moving through the pines, the distant call of a hawk, the faint rustle of leaves under small animals' feet. I could feel the stress of the week melting off as I sat there, alone with the forest. Being a ranger had its challenges, but days like this reminded me why I loved it. After a short break, I decided to check one of the backcountry areas that was known for illegal off-trail camping. The map showed a faint old path leading into a narrow valley, overgrown and largely forgotten. I parked the truck at the old gate and started hiking, carrying only my day pack, ranger vest, and standard safety gear. The trail quickly disappeared under brush and fallen branches, and I had to step carefully over roots and moss-covered rocks. After about an hour, I began to notice signs that someone had been there recently. There were broken twigs along the undergrowth, an old but still smoldering fire ring, an empty can scattered near a small clearing. I jotted everything down in my notebook. Illegal campers weren't just a nuisance. Fires could devastate the forest if left unattended, and trash could attract bears. As I was examining the site, I noticed fresh footprints leading further into the valley. They were large, booted tracks, heading toward a denser section of the forest where sunlight barely reached the ground. I followed them cautiously, aware of the possibility that the campers were still nearby. The deeper I went, the darker and quieter it became. The tall trees blocked the light, and the only sounds were my boots crunching over dry leaves and occasional birds startled into flight. Suddenly, I saw a structure partially hidden among the trees. A small, makeshift shack that looked like it had been built from fallen branches, tarp, and other scavenged materials. It was crude, but functional. Smoke rose lazily from a small chimney, and I knew someone had been living there. This was a serious violation, but I also had to consider safety. Someone could be inside and dangerous. I circled around the shack quietly, noting its construction and taking pictures for my report. There were signs of long-term habitation, a small pile of firewood, a few empty food containers, and a worn sleeping mat. Whoever had been here was prepared to live off the land. The tracks I'd followed matched the boot prints near the creek, so it seemed whoever built this had come through recently. I stayed hidden for a few minutes, making sure no one was around before I slowly retraced my steps to the trail. Back at the truck, I called dispatch to report my findings and requested that park management send a team to deal with the situation. I drove slowly back down the dirt road, my mind still on the remote shack and the person who had chosen to live in such isolation. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. I stopped at a lookout point, leaning against the guardrail, and watched as the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. By the time I returned to the ranger station, the evening shift was starting. I logged my observations, including detailed notes on the footprints, fire ring, and the structure. I made sure to include GPS coordinates so the follow-up team could find it without trouble. Before leaving for the night, I walked along the main road one last time, checking that all gates were secure and all signs of visitors were accounted for. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that, even in such a vast wilderness, I could keep people safe, prevent fires, and protect the forest. That night, as I packed up my equipment and locked the station doors, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. It had been a long day, full of vigilance and observation, but I knew the forest would be safer for it. The person living in that shack might have their reasons, but rules existed for a reason too. Rules that protected the land, the wildlife, and other visitors. I left the station lights on and stepped outside to see the stars overhead, brilliant and clear in the high-altitude sky. I thought about the trails I had walked, the creek I had stopped by, and the hidden shack tucked away in the valley. The forest was quiet, the air clean and sharp, and I knew that, at least for tonight, It was as safe as it could be. Being a park ranger wasn't glamorous. It was long hours, tough conditions, and constant attention to detail. But there was no better feeling than knowing I had made a difference, keeping the forest and its visitors safe and walking the line between wilderness and human activity with care and responsibility. And that night, as I drove home under the blanket of stars, I felt that deep satisfaction that comes only after a day spent fully aware, fully present, and fully responsible for a small piece of the world. I remember the morning like it happened yesterday, even though it's been years. The sky was still a dark, heavy blue when I stepped out of the ranger station and felt the cold nip at my cheeks. Autumn had set in early that year, and the leaves were turning a deep orange and red, carpeting the forest floor in a blanket that made every step feel soft yet uncertain. I was on my usual patrol route in the national park, which spanned a vast stretch of wilderness with dense pine forests, narrow creeks, and jagged rock formations that caught the first rays of sunlight like shards of glass. My job was simple on paper: make sure the park was safe, check for any illegal activity, ensure hikers weren't lost or in trouble, and monitor wildlife activity. In practice, it was far from simple. Out there, you had to pay attention to everything. The subtle shift in a bird's call, a broken branch that didn't match the natural fall pattern, footprints in the mud, or the distant echo of a gunshot that didn't belong. That morning, I started at the northern trailhead near one of the park's largest creeks. The water ran fast, swollen by recent rains, and I could hear the distant crash of it against rocks before I even reached the edge. The air smelled like wet earth, moss, and pine needles, the kind of smell that made you feel alive in a way only complete silence and isolation can. I walked slowly, scanning the tree line for anything unusual. My boots crunched over fallen leaves, and I kept my flashlight in hand, though the sun would be rising fully within an hour. By mid-morning, I had hiked several miles deeper into the park, away from the main trails. I often did this on weekdays because fewer hikers ventured into the backcountry. It was here that the forest showed its raw personality: tangled roots that could trip you in an instant, thick underbrush that hid the occasional deer, and steep hillsides that demanded careful footing. I was used to noticing subtle signs of wildlife, and that day, I saw a set of tracks along a narrow ridge path that looked fresh. They were too large for a coyote, too small for a bear, probably a juvenile elk moving through the area. I made a note in my field log, careful to describe the spacing, depth, and direction, knowing this would help the wildlife team later. Around noon, I reached a small clearing that overlooked a valley. The sunlight streamed through the trees in golden shafts, and for a moment, I just stood there, breathing and listening. Then, something caught my eye. A small vehicle parked awkwardly at the edge of the clearing. It was older, dusty, and clearly had been driven off trail, leaving deep ruts in the soil. My stomach tightened. Vehicles were not allowed in the backcountry, and it was rare to see one so far off the maintained roads. I approached cautiously, noting that the engine was off and no one was around. The doors were locked, but the windows were fogged, as if someone had been inside recently. I radioed in a report to headquarters, noting the license plate and location. I spent the next hour checking the surrounding area, looking for signs of people or campers. Nothing. No footprints, no tents, no discarded food wrappers. Just a car in the forest. It was unusual, but not illegal by itself. Still, I felt uneasy. I marked the location on my GPS and decided to continue my patrol, keeping an eye on the vehicle in case anyone returned. Later that afternoon, I was moving along a ridge that offered a view of a winding creek when I noticed something strange in the distance: a thin column of smoke rising from the trees. At first, I thought it might be a controlled campfire, but the smoke was gray and heavy, not the wispy white you get from a small, contained fire. I quickened my pace, moving through underbrush, careful not to make noise, but anxious to reach the source. The closer I got, the more obvious it became that the fire was unattended and possibly spreading. Fallen leaves and dry grass caught in the breeze, and a sense of urgency replaced my morning calm. I radioed headquarters again and reported a possible wildfire. While waiting for backup, I carefully circled the area, looking for any campers or individuals. There was no one there, just the old vehicle and now this dangerous fire. I knew the park had a protocol for this. Contain if possible without risking life, otherwise evacuate and call for fire response. Using my ranger training, I grabbed a nearby shovel and started creating a small fire break around the edge, moving quickly to slow its spread. It wasn't much, but it gave the firefighters a better chance when they arrived. By the time the fire crew reached the site, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the forest. They took over, and I stepped back, watching as they worked efficiently with hoses and axes, containing what could have become a serious blaze. I later learned that someone had left the vehicle while they went off exploring and had been careless with a small cooking stove, igniting the dry leaves. It could have been catastrophic if I hadn't noticed the smoke early. The rest of the day was spent walking back to the ranger station, tired but satisfied. I documented everything in my report, from the abandoned vehicle to the fire and the tracks I had seen in the morning. By the time I reached the station, the sun had fully set, and the forest was quiet again, only the distant call of an owl breaking the silence. I locked up my gear, poured a cup of coffee, and looked out the window at the trails I had walked. I knew tomorrow I'd have to check on the area again, ensure no smoldering embers remained, and maybe follow up with the park police about the abandoned vehicle. That day reminded me why I loved this job, even with its dangers. The forest is unpredictable, and being a park ranger means paying attention, being ready for anything, and sometimes acting fast to prevent disaster. It's not glamorous. There are no heroic fights or epic confrontations, just careful observation, quick decisions, and a respect for the wilderness that demands your full attention. I went home that night exhausted, but with a deep sense of fulfillment. I had walked the trails, seen the signs, and made a real difference that day. The park remained safe, and the forest continued its quiet life, unaware of the chaos that almost touched it. That's the reality of being a park ranger. Long hours, solitude, small victories, and the satisfaction of knowing that someone is watching over the wild places so others can enjoy them safely. It's hard work, sometimes frustrating, sometimes terrifying, but it's real, it's meaningful. And at the end of the day, there's no better feeling than walking those trails, knowing you've done your part. I had been working as a park ranger in the Rockies for almost 5 years when one of the most grueling weeks of my life occurred. It was mid-September, the time when the forests were a mix of gold and deep green, and the air carried the crispness of approaching winter. Most of the park's visitors had thinned out by then, leaving the trails quiet except for the occasional hiker or the distant call of a bird. The solitude was normally a comfort, but that week it became a pressure, pressing on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The week started on Monday, when a sudden storm swept through the northern part of the park. I was on patrol when the clouds rolled in. They came fast, a dark wall moving over the mountains, and I could feel the first fat drops of rain hitting my jacket before I could reach shelter. I pulled over near a clearing that overlooked a narrow valley, hoping to wait out, but the wind picked up sharply, rattling the windows of my truck. Trees started bending under the gusts, and I realized I had no time to just sit and wait. I grabbed my emergency pack, which I always kept ready for situations like this, and ran a short distance into the tree line, finding a large, low-hanging pine that I could crouch under. The rain lashed at my face, soaking my uniform, and the cold seeped into my bones. I watched the storm rage across the valley, the water flowing in sheets down the rocky slopes, carrying branches and leaves with it. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly nature could turn against you, and I made a mental note to check the trails and small bridges after the storm passed. By Tuesday morning, the storm had moved east, leaving behind mud-slick trails and fallen trees. I spent hours walking those trails, clearing small debris and marking dangerous spots with bright orange tape. I discovered a few hikers who had ignored warning signs and gotten stuck in a section of the trail that had turned into a shallow creek. They were soaked and exhausted, but unharmed. Guiding them back to the main road required patience, as the mud made every step treacherous. I was exhausted by the time I returned to the ranger station, yet I couldn't rest long because my supervisor had scheduled me for a night patrol that evening. The night patrols were always the most challenging. Even when everything seemed quiet, there was a constant tension in the back of your mind. Fallen rocks, loose soil, or a stray animal could turn a simple drive into a life-threatening situation. That night, I drove along the winding mountain roads, headlights cutting through the thick darkness. Fog had settled in low over the valleys, making it impossible to see beyond 50 feet. I slowed the truck to a crawl, scanning the sides of the road for any sign of trouble. Around 11 o'clock, I noticed a section where the fog was denser and a large tree had fallen across the edge of the road. Its roots were half up in the air, and its trunk sprawled across the shoulder. I got out with my flashlight, my boots sinking slightly in the wet soil, and examined the situation. The tree wasn't fully blocking the road yet, but if another storm hit, it could topple completely. I marked the spot with reflective cones and made a note to bring a chainsaw during daylight hours. By Wednesday, I had to hike off trail to inspect a remote section of the park that had been reported to have rock slides from a storm. The terrain was steep and jagged, and I moved carefully, using my trekking poles to balance on the slippery rocks. At one point, I had to cross a narrow ledge that ran along a drop of nearly 60 feet. The wind gusted unpredictably, and I gripped the rock face with both hands, feeling the rough stones scrape my palms. I could see the valley below, thick with fog and shadow, and a herd of deer moving silently along the lower slopes. It was breathtaking, but the danger was real. One misstep, and I could have been seriously injured. The days blended into one another, each bringing new tasks and small emergencies. I had to inspect broken fences, check water levels in streams that had been swollen by rain, and retrieve lost camping equipment from remote areas. On Friday morning, I climbed to a ridge that offered a view of the central part of the park. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the peaks and valleys. I sat on a boulder, exhausted, and watched the mist curl around the mountains. The silence was deep, broken only by the occasional bird call or the distant rumble of a rock slide. I realized in that moment how much responsibility the park carried. I wasn't just walking trails or clearing debris. I was safeguarding people, animals, and the fragile balance of the ecosystem itself. By the weekend, everything had settled. The trails were cleared, fallen trees removed, and the park's visitors returned in small numbers. I drove along the main road one last time that week, reflecting on what had happened. I was physically drained, my muscles sore from climbing, lifting, and walking for hours each day, but I felt a profound satisfaction. Despite the storms, the fog, and the constant challenges, I had made it through. I had prevented injuries, mitigated hazards, and ensured the park remained a safe place for everyone. That week taught me the subtle truths of being a park ranger. It wasn't heroic in a flashy sense, but the work mattered. Every fallen branch I cleared, every mud-covered trail I inspected, every lost hiker I guided to safety, it all added up. By Sunday evening, I returned to the ranger station, tired but content. I cleaned my equipment, checked the radios, and made my notes for the following week. Sitting at the desk, looking out at the last light of the day, settling over the mountains, I understood something I hadn't before. The park wasn't just land. It was responsibility, patience, and perseverance. And though it demanded a lot, it also gave a quiet kind of fulfillment that stayed with you long after the week was over. I locked the station for the night and walked back to my small cabin nearby, the mountains looming behind me like silent, patient guardians. I slept deeply that night, knowing the park was safe, at least for now, and that the work I did mattered in ways that didn't make headlines but were essential all the same. I had been working as a park ranger in the Rockies for almost 5 years when one of the most grueling weeks of my life occurred. It was mid-September, the time when the forests were a mix of gold and deep green, and the air carried the crispness of approaching winter. Most of the park's visitors had thinned out by then, leaving the trails quiet except for the occasional hiker or the distant call of a bird. The solitude was normally a comfort, but that week it became a pressure pressing on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The week started on Monday, when a sudden storm swept through the northern part of the park. I was on patrol when the clouds rolled in. They came fast, a dark wall moving over the mountains, and I could feel the first fat drops of rain hitting my jacket before I could reach shelter. I pulled over near a clearing that overlooked a narrow valley, hoping to wait it out, but the wind picked up sharply, rattling the windows of my truck. Trees started bending under gusts, and I realized I had no time to just sit and wait. I grabbed my emergency pack, which I always kept ready for situations like this, and ran a short distance into the tree line, finding a large, low-hanging pine that I could crouch under. The rain lashed at my face, soaking my uniform, and the cold seeped into my bones. I watched the storm rage across the valley, the water flowing in sheets down the rocky slopes, carrying branches and leaves with it. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly nature could turn against you. And I made a mental note to check the trails and small bridges after the storm passed. By Tuesday morning, the storm had moved east, leaving behind mud-slick trails and fallen trees. I spent hours walking those trails, clearing small debris and marking dangerous spots with bright orange tape. I discovered a few hikers who had ignored warning signs and gotten stuck in a section of the trail that had turned into a shallow creek. They were soaked and exhausted, but unharmed. Guiding them back to the main road required patience, as the mud made every step treacherous. I was exhausted by the time I returned to the ranger station, yet I couldn't rest long because my supervisor had scheduled me for a night patrol that evening. The night patrols were always the most challenging. Even when everything seemed quiet, there was a constant tension in the back of your mind. Fallen rocks, loose soil, or a stray animal could turn a simple drive into a life-threatening situation. That night, I drove along the winding mountain roads, headlights cutting through the thick darkness. Fog had settled in low over the valleys, making it impossible to see beyond 50 feet. I slowed the truck to a crawl, scanning the sides of the road for any sign of trouble. Around 11 o'clock, I noticed a section where the fog was denser and a large tree had fallen across the edge of the road. Its roots were half up in the air, and its trunk sprawled across the shoulder. I got out with my flashlight, my boots sinking slightly in the wet soil, and examined the situation. The tree wasn't fully blocking the road yet, but if another storm hit, it could topple completely. I marked the spot with reflective cones and made a note to bring a chainsaw during daylight hours. By Wednesday, I had to hike off trail to inspect a remote section of the park that had been reported to have rock slides from a storm. The terrain was steep and jagged, and I moved carefully, using my trekking poles to balance on the slippery rocks. At one point, I had to cross a narrow ledge that ran along a drop of nearly 60 feet. The wind gusted unpredictably, and I gripped the rock face with both hands, feeling the rough stones scrape my palms. I could see the valley below, thick with fog and shadow, and a herd of deer moving silently along the lower slopes. It was breathtaking, but the danger was real. One misstep, and I could have been seriously injured. The days blended into one another, each bringing new tasks and small emergencies. I had to inspect broken fences, check water levels in streams that had been swollen by rain, and retrieve lost camping equipment from remote areas. On Friday morning, I climbed to a ridge that offered a view of the central part of the park. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the peaks and valleys. I sat on a boulder, exhausted, and watched the mist curl around the mountains. The silence was deep, broken only by the occasional bird call or the distant rumble of a rock slide. I realized in that moment how much responsibility the park carried. I wasn't just walking trails or clearing debris. I was safeguarding people, animals, and the fragile balance of the ecosystem itself. By the weekend, everything had settled. The trails were cleared, fallen trees removed, and the park's visitors returned in small numbers. I drove along the main road one last time that week, reflecting on what had happened. I was physically drained, my muscles sore from climbing, lifting, and walking for hours each day, but I felt a profound satisfaction. Despite the storms, the fog, and the constant challenges, I had made it through. I had prevented injuries, mitigated hazards, and ensured the park remained a safe place for everyone. That week taught me the subtle truths of being a park ranger. It wasn't heroic in a flashy sense, but the work mattered. Every fallen branch I cleared, every mud-covered trail I inspected, every lost hiker I guided to safety, it all added up. By Sunday evening, I returned to the ranger station, tired but content. I cleaned my equipment, checked the radios, and made my notes for the following week. Sitting at the desk, looking out at the last light of the day, settling over the mountains, I understood something I hadn't before. The park wasn't just land. It was responsibility, patience, and perseverance. And though it demanded a lot, it also gave a quiet kind of fulfillment that stayed with you long after the week was over. I locked the station for the night and walked back to my small cabin nearby, the mountains looming behind me like silent, patient guardians. I slept deeply that night, knowing the park was safe, at least for now, and that the work I did mattered in ways that didn't make headlines but were essential all the same. I remember the morning like it was yesterday, even though it happened years ago. I was on one of my routine patrols in the park, the kind of day that starts quietly but can shift in an instant. The sun was low, spilling light over the ridge lines, and the air was crisp, carrying the earthy smell of pine and damp soil. The trails were quiet, too quiet for a weekend, but the park had been seeing fewer visitors lately. I drove slowly along the winding dirt roads, listening to the hum of my truck and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The forest always feels alive, even when no one is around, and there's a strange comfort in that constant quiet. I had a few things to check that day. The old observation tower on the North Ridge, a fallen tree that had been reported blocking a service road, and some erosion issues near the riverbank. The observation tower was always my first stop because it gave me a good view of the entire park. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The trail leading up to it was disturbed, the dirt scraped in a way that didn't look natural. I slowed the truck and got out. The tracks were deep, fresh, and spread across the narrow path, heading off into the woods. They weren't deer tracks or bear tracks. The prints were too large for a person walking normally, but not quite heavy enough for any large animal I knew. I took a picture with my phone and marked the spot in my notebook. Whatever it was, it had passed through recently. I didn't know what, I didn't like it, but I had other duties to cover. By midday, I was at the service road, where a massive pine had fallen across the path. I spent hours cutting it into sections, clearing the debris so parked vehicles could get through. The chainsaw roared through the trees, and the smell of sawdust mixed with the forest air. While I worked, I kept my eyes on the edge of the woods. I had an instinct, an unease that wouldn't let me settle. The forest was too still, the birds too quiet. I finished clearing the tree just as the sun started dipping behind the mountains, long shadows stretching across the dirt road. The last task was the riverbank. Rain had been heavy the week before, and the water level was high. I walked carefully along the bank, inspecting the erosion and placing sandbags in vulnerable spots. I knew the river could be unpredictable. The ground was soft, wet under my boots, and each step left a clear impression. As I worked, I heard a sudden snapping of branches behind me. I froze. The sound wasn't far, but it wasn't close either, somewhere in between, moving through the undergrowth. I waited, listening. The air was heavy and still. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I tightened the straps on my backpack and decided it was time to head back to the ranger station before dark. The drive back was tense. I kept glancing into the trees, expecting to see something that wasn't there, and the sun dipped lower, turning the sky a dark orange. The road narrowed, winding along cliffs and dense forest. My headlights cut through the gathering shadows, but there were patches of darkness where nothing showed, where I couldn't see more than a few feet. I had been through these roads 1,000 times, but tonight, every turn felt like the first. About 20 minutes from the station, my radio crackled to life. Another ranger reporting a hiker stranded on a trail near the old bridge. I made a mental note and turned the truck around. The bridge wasn't far, but it was tricky terrain, steep, uneven, and with loose rocks along the trail. I parked at the trailhead and took my flashlight and first aid kit. The woods were dense here, and the path was narrow. I moved carefully, scanning the shadows, my boots crunching over loose leaves. I reached the bridge and saw the hiker, an older man, exhausted and shaken, sitting on the edge of the path. He had twisted his ankle and couldn't move. I knelt beside him, checking the injury. It wasn't broken, but he couldn't walk on it. I lifted him carefully into a makeshift carry using my pack straps and my own strength, moving slowly and deliberately along the uneven trail. The forest seemed to press in around us, every sound amplified. The rush of the river below, the whistle of wind through the trees, the distant crack of a falling branch. My heart pounded with the strain and the tension. It took over an hour to get him safely to the truck. By the time we reached the station, night had fully fallen. The sky was deep black, the stars barely visible through the thick canopy. I checked him into the first aid room, made sure he was comfortable, and filed a report. Everything was recorded, the tracks, the noises, the twisted ankle. Nothing supernatural, nothing unexplained, just the raw, unpredictable reality of the wilderness and the responsibility of keeping people safe in it. As I sat back in my chair, exhausted, I realized the weight of what the job really meant. Being a park ranger wasn't about adventure or heroism. It was about awareness, patience, and the quiet persistence of facing the wilderness every day. It was about noticing the subtle signs, the tracks, the quiet, the shadows, and using that knowledge to prevent accidents, to help people, to manage the raw force of nature that didn't care about anyone's plans. That night, I understood more deeply than ever that my role wasn't just to patrol or enforce rules. It was to be the link between human safety and the unpredictable wild. I closed my notebook, turned off the lights, and listened to the wind outside. It was a long night, but the park was safe, and that was all that mattered. I had been working as a park ranger in the Rockies for almost 5 years when one of the most grueling weeks of my life occurred. It was mid-September, the time when the forests were a mix of gold and deep green, and the air carried the crispness of approaching winter. Most of the park's visitors had thinned out by then, leaving the trails quiet except for the occasional hiker or the distant call of a bird. The solitude was normally a comfort, but that week it became a pressure, pressing on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The week started on Monday, when a sudden storm swept through the northern part of the park. I was on patrol when the clouds rolled in. They came fast, a dark wall moving over the mountains, and I could feel the first fat drops of rain hitting my jacket before I could reach shelter. I pulled over near a clearing that overlooked a narrow valley, hoping to wait it out, but the wind picked up sharply, rattling the windows of my truck. Trees started bending under the gusts, and I realized I had no time to just sit and wait. I grabbed my emergency pack, which I always kept ready for situations like this, and ran a short distance into the tree line, finding a large, low-hanging pine that I could crouch under. The rain lashed at my face, soaking my uniform, and the cold seeped into my bones. I watched the storm rage across the valley, the water flowing in sheets down the rocky slopes, carrying branches and leaves with it. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly nature could turn against you. And I made a mental note to check the trails and small bridges after the storm passed. By Tuesday morning, the storm had moved east, leaving behind mud-slick trails and fallen trees. I spent hours walking those trails, clearing small debris and marking dangerous spots with bright orange tape. I discovered a few hikers who had ignored warning signs and gotten stuck in a section of the trail that had turned into a shallow creek. They were soaked and exhausted, but unharmed. Guiding them back to the main road required patience, as the mud made every step treacherous. I was exhausted by the time I returned to the ranger station, yet I couldn't rest long because my supervisor had scheduled me for a night patrol that evening. The night patrols were always the most challenging. Even when everything seemed quiet, there was a constant tension in the back of your mind. Fallen rocks, loose soil, or a stray animal could turn a simple drive into a life-threatening situation. That night, I drove along the winding mountain roads, headlights cutting through the thick darkness. Fog had settled in low over the valleys, making it impossible to see beyond 50 feet. I slowed the truck to a crawl, scanning the sides of the road for any sign of trouble. Around 11 o'clock, I noticed a section where the fog was denser and a large tree had fallen across the edge of the road. Its roots were half up in the air, and its trunk sprawled across the shoulder. I got out with my flashlight, my boots sinking slightly in the wet soil, and examined the situation. The tree wasn't fully blocking the road yet, but if another storm hit, it could topple completely. I marked the spot with reflective cones and made a note to bring a chainsaw during daylight hours. By Wednesday, I had a hike-off trail to inspect a remote section of the park that had been reported to have rock slides from the storm. The terrain was steep and jagged, and I moved carefully, using my trekking poles to balance on the slippery rocks. At one point, I had to cross a narrow ledge that ran along a drop of nearly 60 feet. The wind gusted unpredictably, and I gripped the rock face with both hands, feeling the rough stone scrape my palms. I could see the valley below, thick with fog and shadow, and a herd of deer moving silently along the lower slopes. It was breathtaking, but the danger was real. One misstep, and I could have been seriously injured. The days blended into one another, each bringing new tasks and small emergencies. I had to inspect broken fences, check water levels in streams that had been swollen by rain, and retrieve lost camping equipment from remote areas. On Friday morning, I climbed a ridge that offered a view of the central part of the park. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the peaks and valleys. I sat on a boulder, exhausted, and watched the mist curl around the mountains. The silence was deep, broken only by the occasional bird call or the distant rumble of a rock slide. I realized, in that moment, how much responsibility the park carried. I wasn't just walking trails or clearing debris. I was safeguarding people, animals, and the fragile balance of the ecosystem itself. By the weekend, everything had settled. The trails were cleared, fallen trees removed, and the park's visitors returned in small numbers. I drove along the main road one last time that week, reflecting on what had happened. I was physically drained, my muscles sore from climbing, lifting, and walking for hours each day, but I felt a profound satisfaction. Despite the storms, the fog, and the constant challenges, I had made it through. I had prevented injuries, mitigated hazards, and ensured the park remained a safe place for everyone. That week taught me the subtle truths of being a park ranger. It wasn't heroic in a flashy sense, but the work mattered. Every fallen branch I cleared, every mud-covered trail I inspected, every lost hiker I guided to safety, it all added up. By Sunday evening, I returned to the ranger station, tired but content. I cleaned my equipment, checked the radios, and made my notes for the following week. Sitting at the desk, looking out at the last light of the day, settling over the mountains, I understood something I hadn't before. The park wasn't just land. It was responsibility, patience, and perseverance. And though it demanded a lot, it also gave a quiet kind of fulfillment that stayed with you long after the week was over. I locked the station for the night and walked back to my small cabin nearby, the mountains looming behind me like silent, patient guardians. I slept deeply that night, knowing the park was safe, at least for now, and that the work I did mattered in ways that didn't make headlines but were essential all the same.